Good afternoon, good evening. Hope all of you are well. I just am looking at the people. I think we are missing Shamun and Asiri. I know last week they were attending to some personal things. I hope they can join in today. But we should get a start on and they can join in. Just as a reminder, like last week, we will have all of these sessions recorded. So, and Nida has very kindly started the um, recording. And I thought that I will give you a very brief overview before I hand over to Dr. Anna Chiminto for providing her insights and inputs and walk you through with the materials that she'll cover. So please make a note that it's just today that we started at UK 8:50 a.m. Rest of the 3 days to follow will start at 8:30 a.m. UK time. So please ensure that you join in timely. So this is week two of our continued discussions and overviews around methods in evaluative research, but this week we will focus on the qualitative research methods. And during this week, as facilitators, there will be Anna, which she can introduce herself. You all of you know her. Along with Anna, we will have Najia. Most of you also know her from last year's workshop. She talked us through with the Thinking Healthy program, and you will also be facilitated during this week by Anam. Most of you probably have her as one of your named buddies on your PhD applications, and you also know her from last year. She wasn't there last year, but she can introduce herself as well when the time comes. May I request if all of you can switch on your videos just for a couple of minutes so that we can also, lovely, as always, nice to see you, Nabi, Krishani, and we'll grab a screenshot so that we are all here. Just to walk you through with the agenda, what the week will look like. So today, Anna will walk you all through with the kinds of issues around ethics that may come up, the kinds of principles, as well as the Liverpool procedures. She sent out some materials for you to go through, short reading materials. I hope you've all done that. Then she will jump into giving you some perspectives around qualitative research, the epistemological perspectives. If Shamoon joins in, he will talk about more ethnographic perspectives that are used in qualitative research in day two. You will notice that this week we end at 12 p.m. UK time, so shorter days, but lots of material to cover. Day three will be facilitated by Najia. She will walk you through with the framework approach used in qualitative research. And then day four will end with Anam walking you through with and some orientation and overview around the in vivo software, which is used for qualitative analysis, as well as Najia talking you through with some hands-on practice around how to analyze and transcribe the transcribed data, right? The framework approach. We will have some question answers and reflections, and then we will end the day. As always, like in the last week, every day will start with a short recap, what had been covered, etc. And then we will get into the more thick of things daily. Yes, Nadia, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I would just like to mention that day 3 and day 4 might end at half 12, uh, hopefully half
Sure.
12 by 1. So please be mindful of that. Thank you.
Thank you for that flag, Nadia. And like in last week, I did mention that there is an assignment attached with this week as well. It's to just to help you start thinking about your respective projects. I've told you what the deadline is and when we will give you back the feedback, but it's pretty flexible. I do understand you have multiple things going on. You're trying to finalize not only your research projects protocol, but also writing the systematic reviews. But the idea was to bring these 2 weeks together. The kinds of research methods that most of you are using are generally mixed methods. So once you have the overview, start thinking about what the design issues might be, what the ethical issues might be, the kinds of perspectives that you will take, and send us out an assignment. We'll try and return that to you. So be mindful, and we can be flexible about but as a reminder, 31st of January was the deadline, proposed deadline for handing in your assignments, and end of February we provide you with the feedback. So I'll stop here. Anna, if you want to add anything, Najee, if you want to add anything, and then I will hand it over.
I have
Nothing.
nothing to add.
Great. And Nida, can we have a screenshot of our lovely facilitators and our fellows in the frame, just for our record's sake, for our record keeping? It's
Yes,
always
Dr.
good
Sam.
to cheers. Good. And I will stop sharing the screen. And over to you, Anna.
Okay, I'm going to start sharing another screen. Here we go. We're going to start with a session on ethics. So let me get that into, there we go. Okay, so can everybody now see my screen?
Yes.
Now, the only downside I ever find with this is that the second that you start sharing your screen, it means that I can see less of you in the little boxes on the side, so the pictures and your faces and so on and so forth. So please do, if you have a question or you want to make a comment or whatever, please either raise your hand or put something in the comment chat box just so that I can pick that up. I'll try and keep an eye on that as we're going along. So as well, first of all, I'll just reintroduce myself. So I think you've all met me before at previous enhanced meetings, but just to recap, so I'm Anna Chimento. I'm based at the University of Liverpool. So for me, it's nice and early this morning rather than being later on in the day. I'm based in the Department of Primary Care and Mental Health. I've worked for quite a long time with Siham and Atif and Atula and others involved in the Enhance programme more broadly, and have been conducting global mental health research in a range of geographical locations, including the South Asian region, the Eastern Mediterranean region, parts of the Great Lakes of Africa, and currently also with an Indigenous community in South America. So I'm kind of going to be trying to draw on all of that as we're going through the discussions this morning. Now, I first of all want to recognise that it's a privilege to be able to come and speak to you guys all today using my native language, English. Now, please do stop me if I'm talking too quickly or if I'm using terminology or whatever that isn't fully understandable. I'm very happy to kind of adapt how I'm delivering to kind of ensure that what I'm saying is understandable. I have been asked before to slow down, so don't worry. I know that I sometimes do tend to speak a bit fast. I also think we need to have some regular breaks this morning because I don't know about you, but 3 hours on Zoom is quite intensive. So my aim is to run this initial ethics session from now until about 10:25. There'll be some little activities and things in there, so we'll be having some breaks away from the screen, as it were. Then we'll take a kind of more comprehensive proper step away for about 10 or 15 minutes. come back for the epistemology session, which I'll try and run from about 10:35 till 11:15, have another 5-minute break, and then we'll run up until 12 o'clock. I'm aiming to conclude on time. I will do my best with that. So we have got quite a lot of materials to get through, and everything I am sharing is, as Siham kind of emphasized, really pitched at an introductory level. I've obviously offered a lot of reading resources and other things that I would recommend you exploring kind of more independently and in support with your supervisors, which have all been put into the PebblePad platform. If you've got any questions arising from anything I discussed this morning or from the readings, my email address is there. You've got my contact details. Please feel free to drop me a line. Okay, so diving into our first session, we are starting with the epistemology session. And these are our the ethics session, and our learning objectives for this are to ensure that you've got a kind of fundamental understanding of ethical principles governing human subjects research, some awareness of the procedural ethical governance systems for your research, which in your cases will involve ethical review in your country setting and review by the University of Liverpool, and how to obtain these. And then also having a broader awareness of how ethical principles influence the research design and how it's reported and conducted. And this really also starts to step us a little bit more into our next session on epistemology, where we'll be also thinking about reflexivity and the importance of that, which is particularly strong in the qualitative domain. So the first thing that we're going to look at is this relationship between procedural ethics and in practice ethics. So it's the interconnectedness of processes like the review committees, developing your proposals and applications that you've been through in order to get onto this PhD program, and then obtaining ethical review and other approvals, and then in practice research, which is understood as all those ethically important moments that arise in research practice. And so for this, really, the key thing to take away is that ethics is not just governance. Ethics is not just those approval processes. It continues much more beyond that. So there are two main components to conducting your research ethically. The first is how you design your study. So that's reflected in your research protocol that needs to reflect core ethical principles. And then there is this idea of in practice ethics, delivering your protocol and equipping yourself so that your research practice meets all of those unanticipated or unexpected research challenges with integrity and in line with the ethical principles outlined in your protocol. So in practice ethics essentially incorporates all of these ethically important moments that arise in the conduct of research and often are not fully anticipated at the approval stage. That's not because we haven't thought about them, it's because these are unanticipated. These are things that arise as you interact with other people. So they could encompass issues such as, for example, managing unanticipated disclosure, for example, of health status, such as HIV status, or suicidal ideation, obviously, is one that we commonly think about in mental health research. Or ethically important encounters, such as participants, for example, essentially being over-researched, and instead of sort of wanting to sit down and speak to you properly, this is an example that I heard in my PhD research, they would refer the person to a wall chart that it contained all of the information for their standardized forms. It contained how many children they had, their ages, how many cows they had, their occupations, that, of the different people in the household, etc. So these are examples of real life ethical issues that arise in research studies that really emphasize this in practice ethics, the bit that you as a researcher need to just be able to respond in line with the principles of your protocol and in a way that ensures that research maintains ethical standards and integrity. So it's important to obviously recognize that ethics arises in every study at all stages. So from choosing your research question, your research design, your methods, to how you engage with your participants and how you disseminate and feedback your research findings. So I'm going to share with you a little bit some findings from my PhD research, which explored this specific disjuncture between procedural and in-practice research ethics. And this was conducted in South Asia in 3 countries, looking at specifically mental health research. So what I learned was that participants felt that research ethics was very standardized. So very standardized, that research protocols are very generalized, and that they often do not consider contextual factors. And that ethics is mediated via those forms, via those very template versions of research ethics forms, and that it's considered that ethics is done once you have ethical approval, and then you move to the real work of conducting research. There was also an emphasis on monitoring of ethics, checking signatures on informed consent forms, or correct storage of data, or charging tablets for the next day, etc. And so ethical monitoring became those auditable and objectively verifiable actions. So very much concentrating on what we can see and what we can capture, rather than thinking about that relationship with the participant, which really is, in this case, where ethics sits. There was a recognition that often countries were not tailor-making their ethical processes for the population enough. And then for mental health research, it was recognized that mental health is a sensitive topic with a strong emphasis on the potential for stigma and social harm. So that's obviously a really important ethical consideration. And the response to this was in the training and in preparation for research assistants and researchers was to adopt what they termed an empathetic stance. So the focus really on the interpersonal relationships and the highly personal nature of talking about and responding to distress. It was also important to recognize here that the research intervention overlap in the sort of mental health research that many of you will be conducting as your PhD research, and thinking about the need to guard against therapeutic misconception. So where, for example, participants wrongly attribute therapeutic benefit to an intervention that is actually still under study. Now, in the context of the Thinking Healthy programme, obviously, we do have evidence that it's very effective. So we're looking more at the delivery mechanisms in your studies, from what I understand. But that is something to also be aware of and think about, and ensure that your participants understand that what they're participating in is a research project, not a therapeutic intervention solely. It's got the research attached. Other things that we heard about was that researchers often face ethical challenges as research protocols and the field realities interact with one another. And the key reason for that is, as we saw on the last slide, the lack of contextual information in those procedural documents, and a lack of considering that absolutely critically important element of the researcher's interpersonal engagement with the lived reality of participants. And this goes beyond the researcher sitting down and asking certain questions. It's all of those other things that surround that. If you are going into a participant's home, that already brings with it significant ethical dynamics, particularly in settings where there are hospitality norms at play, particularly where you may be going into settings with higher levels of poverty, for example. So it comes down to thinking about how you dress, how you approach people, how you talk to people. So it was recognised by everybody that I spoke to, and we spoke to primary investigators all the way down to your field researchers, that to implement research on the ground requires protocols to be reinterpreted in light of context. So really relying on that gut feeling, is it right or wrong? And there's a quote here that said, the principles remain the same, but their application can only come from a deep understanding of the population, working with them, knowing their priorities, their culture, what's important to them. You are part of the situation. So that's a really nice one to kind of really encapsulate the breadth of considerations and the breadth of things that are going on there that are encompassing whether that encounter sort of adheres to in-practice ethics. And there are, you know, this gap between what the procedures say and what the realities on the ground are like can lead to unethical behaviour. So it can lead to researchers, for example, falsifying data, it can also just simply lead to researchers not responding appropriately to ethical moments such as unanticipated disclosures. Okay, and then this is just a broader thing just for you to hold in mind, really. And I think that this is particularly important in the current moment that we're in with COVID and all the rest of it. But actually thinking about this broader context in which we sit in at the moment. So there are some broader movements and considerations in the literature that are really coming through at the moment in the mental health context, including obviously COVID-19 is a really big one. And I'm not sure if any of you have read the Richard Horton article, but he has termed the COVID-19 context a syndemic. Which basically is him picking up on a term coined by Merrill Singer many years ago, which characterizes the biological and social interactions that increase a person's susceptibility of harm or worsen their outcomes. And we've been hearing about this more recently in the context of the environmental and climate emergency. So there are lots of these background contextual considerations that it's very important to be thinking about, because these interact with your study protocol, with your research design, and so how these intersect and the impact both of the public discourse around these topics, for how they sort of shape your response to these issues and how they might arise in your study. So this is also part of that kind of broader ethical thinking. So that's an initial broad overview of some context and sort of where I'm coming from when I'm thinking about ethics. So as you can see, broader than necessarily just the procedural side of things. However, I am now going to kind of unpack some of those basic principles that we all need to be thinking about when we're conducting research with humans. First of all, just to recap, this comes very much from the article that was on the recommended reading, the Beecher article. So I'm not going to cover it in huge amounts of detail, but this just summarizes some of the key milestones in the emergence of medical research ethics. So obviously we have right back at the beginning was the Nuremberg Code, which is often credited as the first attempt to create a set of ethical principles to govern research. And it was in response to revelations of the work of Nazi medical scientists, such as the hypothermia trials, where participation in research was generally very much forced. The Beecher article obviously was on the reading list, and this essentially demonstrated that poor standards weren't confined to settings such as Nazi Germany, but were actually being practiced at institutions across the US. And Papworth, incidentally, had written something similar about researchers in the UK as well. And the interesting thing about this article is that Beecher feels that this was due to thoughtlessness or carelessness of investigators rather than deliberate unethical practice. So he critiqued the idea that informed consent was necessarily the best way to go about protecting research participants, and suggested that more important than that was a truly responsible investigator. And so the outcome of his whistleblowing article was a reconsideration of ethical codes and systems of procedural ethics, including the establishment of ethical review boards. So ironically, actually moved towards increased proceduralization rather than, as he was emphasizing, increased responsibilization of the individual researcher. Subsequent to this were other scandals from the US setting, so Tuskegee, which is the study that was intended to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis, which particularly targeted Black individuals. And the study continued once an effective treatment for syphilis was known, so obviously highly unethical in that context. And the African-American men that were involved in the study were told they were receiving free healthcare from the United States government. And this actually didn't stop happening until 1972, so fairly recently. There are the learning that sort of happened as a result of the unethical conduct of research that was exposed in this and many other examples led to the development of the various codes of ethics in both Europe and in the US, which continue to provide the core framework for research ethics today. And these codes are regularly reviewed and updated. So, for example, the latest update of the SIOMS guidelines includes extensive consideration of conducting research in developing countries. And generally, the justifications for the research ethics regime are firstly to protect participants, ensuring that research is conducted safely and that participants are treated with respect. Secondly, to protect researchers, ensuring that research is carried out according to legal and ethical principles and rules. And thirdly, to protect the integrity of research more generally. So poor research conduct, such as the examples that are here on the slide, as well as in the UK, there have been some huge scandals. Alder Hey Hospital, who you're probably all familiar with, had a big problem with organs being taken from babies. And these really damage research, they damage public perceptions of and trust in researchers, and in fact clinicians. So it does have huge consequences when research is not conducted in line with ethical standards. So just to recap, generally research ethics is conceptualized around what's known as principalism, which emphasizes 4 key principles: those of maximizing the benefits or beneficence, minimizing the harms or maleficence, autonomy, and justice. So when we talk about ethics, that first thing that comes to mind is often the formal guidelines and frameworks that define the ethical principles, which are essentially statements that codify the norms of practice for researchers. And that alongside those procedures, the written protocol, your written informed consent form, the ethical review, etc. Most biomedical and increasingly social science guidelines are founded upon these 4 core tenets of principalism. And these are assumed to be universally applicable, and that from these 4 core principles, any ethical problem in research can be addressed. Now, there are critiques of this approach. There's a philosophical critique of principalism that it lacks a unifying moral theory and is therefore a poor guide to action. And the core one really is that principalism is frequently in a regulatory form translated into things that you can do and things you cannot do, which encourage kind of rote application rather than, as Beecher was calling for, an informed and a thoughtful researcher who really critically reflects on the right action in a given context. So the final thing just to emphasize is that informed consent, obviously, as you will all be well aware, carries a lot of normative weight in research ethics, primarily for achieving those key principles of respect and autonomy. Informed consent has 3 basic elements: thinking about capacity, thinking about the information, and thinking about voluntariness. And it's important to think about all 3 of these in relation to your specific participant group and your study when designing your informed consent process. And we will unpack these 3 a little bit more shortly. There are some other considerations as well if you're thinking about conducting research with children or those that lack capacity to consent, which obviously we will pick up on. Okay, I'm going to pause very briefly and just check whether there are any specific questions before I nip through very brief considerations in implementation research. How are we all doing? Am I going okay? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, we'll keep going then. So I wanted to pick up a little bit on this, and I'm pleased I have. Oh, do you know what? I'm just going to have a quick sip of tea. That's better. Because obviously a lot of you are doing mixed method studies, and a lot of what you're looking at, on my understanding anyway, thinking about the mode of delivery and thinking about really integrating a service into existing systems with existing groups. So often that is considered through an implementation research lens. Now, implementation research does in itself raise specific additional considerations. No problem, Sihan. Okay, so the additional considerations. So there are some ethically important differences in implementation research versus biomedical research. So it specifically, implementation research differs because it looks to understand a real world context, as opposed to that more ideal conditions of efficacy-based research. And so that can really further blur those lines between routine healthcare and research itself. Often implementation research is using an iterative or dynamic design. So as opposed to a fixed design that's very determined before you start conducting research, it can often evolve in the course of a study. Nadia?
Sorry, I would just like to know what IR stands for. Maybe
implementation research.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, no, it's my fault. Sorry, I should have put that on the slide somewhere. Yes, IR is implementation research. And the final core thing is that implementation research generally is looking more at the population level rather than individual level outcomes. And obviously this kind of depends on the specific study design. And these core considerations really raise ethical issues that are quite distinctive to this research design and approach. So, for example, studies that test the financial incentives to promote healthy behaviours. The ethical issues in that arise at a population level, including how to appropriately weigh benefits of the incentive provided in relation to anticipated risks, and assessing the intervention's impact on the distribution of inequalities in a health population. So are existing social inequalities actually exacerbated by sort of incentive-based programs? And there is some evidence for that. So here, the biomedical focus on autonomy and concerns that this may be undermined due to inducement. They may be an inappropriate standard where the population regard the incentivized behavior as worthwhile. So that's just kind of one example of where, when you're considering the kind of standard biomedical ethical research standards in an implementation research context, you're actually kind of unpacking things at slightly different levels, and therefore if we apply those biomedical standards to implementation research, it can actually lead to poor decisions that would impede the conduct of important research. Some other points, I don't know why my system sets up so I have to click through everything. Anyway, this paper I would actually recommend. It describes some concepts identified during the development and piloting of a toolkit on ethics on implementation research that was supported by the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems Research, which is something that I'm pretty sure I put on your reading list as something that I would recommend going away to explore. It was developed by researchers, ethicists, practitioners, ethical review board members, and policy experts, and really seeks to sort of unpack some of these issues that are on the slide here around meaningful engagement with stakeholders, including the communities and research participants, and the risks of implementation research due to the risks being more difficult to anticipate, often because they're at the population level, and can be hugely context specific to the intervention and the setting in which you're delivering it. The other consideration is that the benefits of implementation research might not be felt by the same group of people who participate in the research. So, for example, an interesting one at the moment is the COVID vaccine rollout, where the benefits actually are not necessarily being felt by the same group of people who are necessarily fully participating in those research trials. So they raise some important ethical considerations that are specific to this much broader implementation approach to research. This again is simply to emphasize that the ethical issues arise at every stage of the implementation research process. And this table is actually a really useful one that I would recommend kind of revisiting as you're thinking through your protocol, to systematically map those ethical considerations that arise in relation to your study at the various stages. And then finally, I just, because this is a bit of a whirlwind tour, I do recommend these papers that are on the reading list as a really useful starting point for thinking about the specific ethical issues that arise in implementation research. And alongside the document that you can see on the right there, the Ethics and Implementation Research Participant Guide, there's a training course with that, materials for which are freely available online. So that's perhaps something that, depending on the context of your study, could be quite useful to dive into. Now I'm going to take a moment here just to pause and offer the opportunity for any considerations to be raised in relation to your own studies. So have any of the pre-reading kind of prompted you to think about any specific things? Are there any questions you'd like to bring to the group? Or just to take a couple of moments to note down any thoughts perhaps that have arisen as a result of what I've just shared. So I'll just pause there for a moment.
So yeah, while I was reading the articles, two things came to my mind. So one is of the informed consent. So I was reflecting, so it's not just about administering informed consent, but then it's a huge question, like who administers the informed consent is also a big concern, because in a medical field, oftentimes when the physician administers informed consent, the patient is likely to adhere. So yeah, that was one of the things. And I was also reflecting in our project, since we are going to a local rural community. So when we go there, like, you know, given our position, given our employment at the NGO, there are chances that people might readily accept our to participate in the study. And I was just wondering, like, how could we, you know, balance it out, like, you know, to make it real so that they really agree, not just because of our position, but then that they are informed and that they that it is out of their voluntary participation. So that's one. And the other one was, like, you know, the article you suggested by Gopi Chandran. So one of the areas was the capacity building, and oftentimes with these multinational researches that are being conducted at LMICs, there is this huge component of capacity building. But I was also reflecting, like, you know, oftentimes when we go to the local rural community, are we concerned about building their capacity from the local community? So I'm based in Kathmandu, so I might benefit from all of these capacity building opportunities, but what about the local community where I'm actually conducting my study? So these are two of the things that struck my mind when I was reading those articles.
Thanks so much, Prasanta, for raising those considerations. So on the first reflection that you made around where physicians ask for consent, there was actually a study done in the US by the NIH, Cass et al., I think is the paper, where she looked specifically at this issue of the impact that it has on a physician asking people on the kind of decision-making processes. And there was a lot there, and this is a particular area of interest in research ethics more broadly at the moment, around issues of trust, and that prior relationship being very crucial to people feeling like they wanted to participate in research, and also that skewing slightly their perception of whether the research they were invited to take part in would be helpful. Often these were randomized control trials, often these were on conditions you know, such as cancer, very experimental treatments, where you may well be allocated to a placebo group. And sort of participants' decision making there was certainly affected by who was asking them for consent. So that is a really important consideration. It's a very difficult one, though, because there are benefits as well as sort of challenges with who is asking. And of course, you go to the other extreme. If it's somebody completely objective with whom people have no relationship whatsoever, potentially then they are missing out on participating in something. So, you know, these things are never that clear cut. Your other questions. So the one on capacity building, I'm going to go to first, partly because the other one's escaping my mind at the moment, but I think the capacity building point is really important. I'm not a big fan of the term capacity building because it implies that somebody is coming in and simply imparting knowledge to somebody else. Whereas in my experience, every time that you engage with people working in different settings, whether that's high income to low income country, whether that's a capital city to a local community, that learning, it goes both ways. So it's an exchange of knowledge and experience and building of understanding both ways. So I like to think of it more as collaborative learning than capacity building per se. And I absolutely think that your point about what sort of strengthening and what sort of benefits you could potentially provide to the local community where you're going to conduct your study. And this is where it can be really helpful in research projects to have representatives from the local community involved in the development of your research protocol and your research ideas. So they can then be helping you to think through what are the benefits that you might be able to support within the local community. And those benefits could, of course, be directly related to conducting the research itself, or they could be wider benefits, like you're saying, delivering additional trainings or supporting, I don't know whether the local community have a particular interest in getting a certain plight recognized by a certain person. I don't know. There's a whole range of considerations that you can think about and you can look at for how feasible they are, obviously recognizing that you are conducting a PhD study and you have limited resources. But thinking through how you could integrate a component of that. Another one is if you're going to be working with a local team, for example, are they people who are interested in a research career more broadly? And what could you be imparting to them based on what you're learning? So, you know, to what extent, for example, could you sit down and have a conversation with them for half an hour about the importance of research ethics and where that sits in relation to a study that goes beyond them asking for informed consent and doing that in an appropriate way? So that would, in my view, be considered to sort of fit that capacity building box. But it would also be something that has reciprocal benefits. So it's you supporting them, but what they tell you about their experiences, perhaps of going to participants, how participants react, or helping you prepare for how you go into a local community, that also has reciprocal benefits for how you conduct your study. And I'm really sorry, I've forgotten the question that was in the middle. It's gone clean out my mind. Information, wasn't it? It was how do you check that somebody has understood what you're saying and that they're participating voluntarily? So we'll come to this a little bit more later on, but one of the key things that we've used in a number of studies that I've been involved in is to have reflective questions. So after you've provided a chunk of information about a study, you then kind of ask a question for a participant to reflect that back to you. So this is essentially a way of checking that they're listening and that they're understanding the information you're giving them. So if, for example, you had just told them that you would not be giving them any money and that the benefits of the study would be for the population, and then you said to them, can you just tell me what the benefits of taking part in the study are? And they reflect back the thing that you've just said, then you know that they have fully understood that they will not be getting any, financial incentives or specific individual benefits, which often is an area that gets misunderstood, particularly if you're going in as an NGO in the sort of developing regions. Often there's an expectation of some element of financial compensation. So those are small steps that you can take and you can build into your informed consent process, just to try and check that that information has been genuinely understood. Are those helpful responses?
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you very much for those questions. Has anyone else got any comments or thoughts? Okay, we will continue then, and now we're really going to try and unpack some of those core considerations when writing a research protocol. Now, I'm aware this is something you're all engaged in at the moment, and hopefully this will, you know, potentially act more as a recap onto how well you have considered these elements as you're kind of moving towards applying for ethical approval. So a research protocol is obviously comprised of a number of components. We have the research question, and there are ethical issues that arise in research priority settings. So who determines what questions are worth being answered? And often this is complex and it involves researchers, but also funders and wider influences such as government priorities, strategies, international documents, etc., that influence where we look for solutions to questions. So thinking about that is quite important, and it can help to think about involvement in that context. Sorry, and that's the table across here on the right is about involvement. So ensuring the involvement of representatives of your target community is one way to check the relevance of your research question and the appropriateness of your research design and procedures. There's a definition of involvement from an organization called Involve, which moves towards co-production. So they talk about a way of working that involves people who use health and care services, carers and communities in equal partnership, and which engages groups of people at the earliest stages of service design, research development, and evaluation. So a collaborative or partnership way of working can help to enhance the ethical grounding of your study. And it also can support you with kind of going in and out of the community. It provides that touchstone for you to work with throughout the conduct of your study. So if you can identify a few people relevant to your study to sort of set up a bit of a steering committee, as I said, or experts by experience type group, then that would be really beneficial and something I would encourage. So methods, it's important to remember that research design is an ethical issue. Often people think that this shouldn't be considered when it comes to ethics, but it is very important. And in mental health research, there are a number of specific considerations that carry both methodological and ethical implications. So these are, for example, if you're using a standardized measurement tool, who has it been validated with? Does it include people in your target population, men, women, the ethnicities? Is the administration approach of that instrument accessible? Are there any problems with the application of that tool in particular populations? And in global mental health, these concerns relate to decolonization efforts and a drive to ensure that tools are relevant and reliable in the population in which they're applied. So again, going back to that slide that I shared around the socio-political dynamics, this is where we're starting to see that overlay of those broader concerns with specific methodological and ethical concerns. In qualitative research, methodologically, there are concerns as well. So do aspects of your questions raise, if you're doing interviews or focus groups, do they raise implicit assumptions that might be biased towards a specific gender, towards a specific education level, or knowledge of local language, or specifically technical language? And there are also methodological tensions that also sit behind ideas of giving voice, showing respect, prioritizing diversity, equality, and inclusion. So recognizing these systemic issues of racism, injustice, and inequalities. And often, you know, qualitative research is kind of motivated to kind of unpack and identify and help us respond to some of these tensions. There's also, of course, thinking about your participants is a key aspect of your research protocol. So do your study population have characteristics that have ethical relevance? So do they include children, refugees, IDPs, internally displaced persons, prisoners, homeless, those who maybe lack capacity? All of those carry ethical weight and need to be dealt with in your protocol. With regards to sampling, the key thing here is fairness. So is your sampling approach fair? Are the burdens and benefits of participating in your research shared across the population? In terms of your inclusion and exclusion criteria, are there individuals who may be at particular risk of adverse outcomes within the population excluded? Is that justifiable? And finally, it's important to think about the smallest sample possible that needed to answer your research question. So you're limiting the exposure to risks and the burden of research participation, as well as the costs of conducting research. Some other elements of the protocol around risks and burdens. And as I was highlighting earlier, the emotional, psychological, or social harm are very important to consider in the context of mental health research, particularly in settings where stigma is potentially a challenge. You also need to think about what actually constitutes harm. Is it just feeling harmed or feeling wronged, or is it also being made worse off? And this is where issues of risk and harm kind of intersect with ideas of vulnerability. So what does it mean to say somebody is vulnerable? There's a reading on the list that I provided, Francina Luna, who thinks about vulnerability, I think, in a really useful way that is very grounded and very operationalized. So I'd encourage you to think about your study population in this way, so that vulnerability is a specific idea that gives rise to specific potential risks or potential ethical considerations. And then you can demonstrate how those specific things will be addressed, rather than vulnerability being a very broad catch-all that simply applies because somebody is considered to fall into a category that covers that. So I'd encourage thinking about vulnerability in that way, and that can help you with thinking through risks and burdens. Recruitment, it can really help to physically sometimes map the various contacts, connections along your recruitment pathway. And this picks up again, Prasantha, on something you were saying about who it is who's asking for consent or who's approaching your participants. And really also being aware that there are confidentiality and data protection considerations at each of those stages that will need to be addressed and managed and thought through. So how are you going to reach out to your participants about your study? Is it going to be a word of mouth thing? Is it going to be through healthcare professionals or visitors or potentially school settings? Or is it going to be a broader kind of community-based thing, kind of talked about at a community meeting? All of these carry specific implications for who might be recruited and how. Confidentiality and privacy, please be aware these do not refer to the same thing. So there is a distinction. Privacy is the right to have your personal data protected against deliberate or inadvertent disclosure. Confidentiality is a personal promise not to disclose information. However, particularly in the mental health context, be aware of unconditional promises of confidentiality. As with clinical practice, there may be a duty to disclose under certain circumstances, and often that relates to, for example, suicidal ideation. And when you're thinking through data protection, it can really help to map physically the journey your data will go on. So to think about the various points of transfer and how you will ensure that information remains secure. Risks to the researcher, definitely need to think about elements of physical safety of the research team, and also things like lone working. So whether you're going into somebody's home on your own, are there any safety considerations there? But beyond that, and this kind of goes back to this question of the different types of harm, is thinking about the emotional risks that come with engaging with people's lives at potentially distressing times and potentially distressing points. So how are you going to support both yourself and your wider research team, if you have one, with those sorts of interactions? Nadia, please.
So, Anna, I have a question. So
Mhm.
in some cultures, as you know, it's quite acceptable for the parents to be giving a slap to their child. And sometimes when we are interviewing women, they do mention that, oh, they were very angry and then they slapped their child and they were feeling guilty afterwards. So this then raises the ethical dilemma of whether this should be informed or this should not be informed. Or sometimes what happens is that the wife report that her husband came home yesterday and he was very upset and then he slapped her.
Yeah.
Although strictly speaking, these are the things which needs to be reported. But in that particular cultural context, this is, if you start reporting these things, these, although they are not minor, but you know that these are common practices, then it becomes very difficult. So where do we stand ethically on such issues?
This is a really important and a really hard question. I remember trying to think this through for a study that we were doing in Pakistan, and this issue arose because if you did identify elements of domestic violence or similar considerations, there were no reliable services that you could support a woman to access. So in my view, in that case, actually the ethical tension is the risk you're putting the woman at by identifying her where there is not an appropriate safeguard that sits behind that. And I'm imagining, I've never come across it in the context of sort of child protection, but I'm imagining the system is very similar when it comes to child protection. And so then I guess the position is more about making sure that if these things are being are arising, that the researcher has a context in which they can debrief and they can get support. And I suggest in this context, it probably would be through your supervisory team as the first point of contact to be raising these sorts of issues if you're coming across them. And the other thing is to think about the local context. And, you know, obviously I'm talking about the Pakistani context. I'm less familiar with Nepal, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and how the systems work there. And what, as you're emphasizing, Nadia, what the norms are. So I think all of those things need to be taken into consideration and to be balanced. And this again is where your kind of experts by experience or people from your local community are particularly beneficial. You might be able to have a conversation with them about if this were to arise, what would be the appropriate way for us to react. And that may well be more around kind of educating people that actually, you know, perhaps is there an alternative way we could think about disciplining your children that doesn't involve physical harm, for example? Wider challenges of, you know, domestic abuse and things like that are more challenging to obviously address.
And actually, sorry to interrupt you, Anna, but this is exactly what is happening with our intervention teams. If a mother reports something like this, an incident, if it is something which is happening repeatedly, that of course some action needs to be taken. But then they raise awareness in them. For example, if they tell that they have hit their child, then they tell them the impact of abusive behavior toward their children, and also they make them aware of the different options which are available. They rather discuss with them that what are the options available to them, and just raising information, because we know that now there is a rule in Pakistan that if a woman experiences domestic abuse, it's a criminal offense and they can go and they can inform the police, and there will be some the police gets involved, but it's a very messy business. And at the end of the day, the husband, no longer how long you are going to put him in the jail, he is going to come back and start living in the same house. What will happen then, God knows. So even
and the broader societal challenges, aren't there, because of stigma of that sort of, you know, and whether by removing the male who often is a breadwinner, for example, within the family, you are then putting the family more broadly into a situation of potential poverty. So it really is, these issues are not straightforward at all and very, very complex. And what you're saying, Nadia, to me makes perfect sense. And perhaps if participants, you know, if you think that these sorts of issues might arise in your research, maybe it would be worth talking to Najia about the approach that you've taken and how you've supported your research team to have those conversations in really, you know, meaningful and supportive ways with participants, because that to me sounds like an important first step, and it does fulfill the ethical responsibility to make sure that goes acknowledged and isn't kind of ignored, which I think often that's the easier approach, is to brush it under the carpet and move on to your next question.
And I think from that perspective, if you are doing research in West, it is much more, you know exactly what you are doing, which services you are going to refer to that person, but it becomes much more complex when you are doing research in underdeveloped countries where services are not that established or not that effective. And
although I have to say at the moment, it's, you know, it's I would say a lot of the challenges exist in the same way, because it's whether a woman feels ready or a man feels ready to take that step is often the biggest barrier.
And another ethical dilemma which our teams experience is that sometimes the participants, they come to them, and that happens a lot during this lockdown period, and they are crying their eyes out because they don't have anything to eat and their children are hungry. So just imagine how much pressure it puts on the therapist who is listening to all this, but her hands are tied, because even if she has some money and she is willing to give to that person, she can't, because this is a research trial. But that puts them under a lot of stress, under a lot of guilt. So next time they sit with their food plate in front of them, they are feeling guilty that, even when they could have helped, they didn't.
Yeah. So this is another one. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Patricia Kingori, but she looked at this a lot in the context, Kenya, I think, is where she did her study. But she was unpacking what it was that kind of motivated the research assistants and their view of kind of what the ethical considerations were. And these considerations came up much more, questions of justice and social justice in particular. And she found that the research assistants were frequently paying out of pocket for medication, for food, for basic necessities for their research participants, because they felt that was what should have been provided. So this is kind of where, again, it comes back to a really, you know, deep understanding of your local population. And if you know you're going into a setting where there are high levels of poverty and people are really going to be struggling in that way, then perhaps you design your study in a way that means that your gift to them is something useful, a bag of flour, or, you know, something like that you could physically take along and you could give to them, and that's meaningful and useful to them. And that would, then of course you get into questions of inducement and undue inducement, but something small like that, which could make a significant difference to them in their context, but that actually also is an appropriate kind of payment for the half an hour or an hour of time that they're giving to you. So it kind of, you know, we do need to recognize that people give up their time, and often, you know, in mental health research, it's a very emotional experience for them as well as for us as researchers. And the final point, I think, is to make sure that there are regular feedback loops. If you have a research team, and Najia, the fact that you have all of these examples shows that your research team are coming back and telling you, this is what I experienced today. That is a massive step forward. A lot of research projects don't have that happening in a very active way. And the more aware that people are of the on-the-ground realities, the more that this stuff gets considered at the research development stage, and the more that you know, we can build these things in to support the research team on the ground before they go in, so that they are well equipped and prepared, and then we provide that support going along. That's kind of, I think, the balance.
Because COVID landed in the middle of our trial, so that was the first time when the research therapists were actually crying in the supervision session. That never happened before, but they were feeling so helpless. And I think also, I mean, in every, also the ethical dilemma of what your religion or your faith says to help those who really need it, and then you can't do it. So all these interplay.
It gets very complicated.
Just a small point. Please also do keep in mind that many of and I'm talking about contexts like Pakistan. Many of the women also find talking to an assessment team, somebody, extremely therapeutic. So don't chuck that aspect out as well. Perhaps I know from my research team, first time ever, we systematically tried to assess intimate partner violence. We took good 1 year to pilot, etc. And but we were very afraid what to do. The systems aren't there, etc. Right? And many of the women, for the first time ever, reported because nobody had asked them about this. So it was very therapeutic and very relieving for them personally as well. So all of this comes into that play when you know the context and what appropriately you can and cannot perhaps offer. I'm sure there is, it's not easy, but telling somebody that I will breach the confidentiality when the time comes, and those are the things that I will have to step out. So this is, I'm informing you. So I've always found that extremely difficult. It's like breaking bad news to somebody. So how do you do that? How do you understand the context of your current settings where you're working? So I just wanted to raise that point as well from the perspective of the participant.
Yeah, no, thank you, Siham. That's a really important one as well, is obviously to recognize that there are benefits that accrue from actually having the opportunity to talk about these things.
Pragya has her hand raised.
Yeah, this discussion reminds me of some of my research colleague before, some years back. They were saying that they have a list of questionnaire to ask to the respondent, and while asking those questions, they have like a lot of triggers, the past triggers, and they started crying, and they asked us as I being a counselor. So they were asking us to give some basic skills how to deal when the people are when the respondent are distressed. So we gave kind of a few sessions on basic helping skills. So after the questionnaire you completed, psychosocial support you can give. This discussion just remind me of those experience shared by our research colleague.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And that's another really important suggestion. And again, it sounds like, and this is another important, obviously the idea between having the enhance kind of fellows all working alongside one another is you can share these sorts of resources and these ideas and these approaches that you've taken that sound brilliant, absolutely perfect. That very much Pragya picks up on what we were saying with Nadia around, how do you have these appropriate conversations and how do you support people, and actually just having a few very basic strategies again leaves somebody with something after you've finished asking your questions, so that they are getting that wider benefit. So all of these are really important things to be thinking about and to be integrating into your research. So really useful and interesting discussion. I kind of wish we could carry on, but I'm conscious that we're not going to get through everything if we keep going. So thank you very much. But I'm going to try and just nip through the rest of this section. The last thing on this slide was around dissemination and the ethical imperative to make sure we disseminate our research results, and need to be thinking about who we're disseminating to, how and when. So often with participants, it's helpful to send a lay summary, obviously being mindful of privacy considerations. The wider population, it's often a case of peer-reviewed publications for the academic audience and broader public or policy engagement, and particularly in the context of the work that you'll be doing, also to practitioner audiences. Now, coming back to this issue of consent, which obviously is going to be pretty central in everybody's research protocol. So just to unpack these three components, there are some questions that it's helpful to ask yourself about. So when it comes to information, what are the important things about your study that participants should know in order to make a decision about participating? and how are you going to make sure they understand this information? Again, this picks up on our earlier conversation. One way of doing that is to ask very simple questions that mean that the research participants reflect back the information you've given them. How much information is enough? Now, there's some interesting sort of legal cases that have happened around this. So, for example, in the UK, there's this Montgomery case, which is a clinical practice case where the UK Supreme Court ruled that a woman in childbirth hadn't been given enough information to make informed decision about her care. So she had been experienced a specific type of procedure, and after that procedure, the UK Supreme Court decided that she hadn't received enough information to inform that. There is a lot of research on the length of informed consent materials. A recent study that looked at informed consent documents for example, COVID-19 vaccine trials found that they had a mean of over 8,000 words and took an average of 35 minutes to read, and were scored to have a difficult level of language comprehensibility. And findings echoing this have been reported across research for some time. In your studies, these will be potentially augmented due to the translation element of developing these materials in appropriate lay language in your local languages, where, for example, key words, key terminology might not exist in the local languages in which you guys are operating. So researchers really do face some tensions here around meeting procedural requirements and ensuring that information is clear and accessible. And it's a tightrope that every study has to walk. The HRA, this is a UK institution, the Health Research Authority. They actually have some really useful resources. So I would suggest having a look at those. They really stress things like the use of subheadings, using diagrams, fundamentally really being brief and simple, making information sources accessible through visualization. And another key tip is to pilot any materials you have and get feedback. So again, this is where your local community contacts are key. Sharing them with those stakeholders and steering groups, people who preferably share the characteristics of those you will be looking to recruit, to check how those materials are received. So that's the information side. Capacity. Okay. These down. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the laws and procedures around establishing capacity from a clinical context. And these are obviously also relevant in a research context. So a key ethical tension here is in mental health research is the complexities of those who lack capacity or whose capacity might actually flux during the study. So this can often lead to a blanket exclusion of people who don't have capacity for research participation. And of course, that in turn holds its own ethical implications. If we're generating an evidence base for a certain type of treatment and we are systematically excluding a certain population, then do we know whether that treatment is effective for that subpopulation or not? So these are around the moral duties of researchers. Are we morally obliged to assist participants in being able to consent, and how might this be achieved? Equally, there's a moral duty to protect those without capacity from exploitation. So again, you know, none of these things are straightforward. It again comes down to thinking about your local context, thinking about your resources and the structures that you have in place. And again, this is thinking through with your research team, your supervisors, about how you think you might consider this facet of capacity in your studies, and where you're going to draw the distinction between who will be included and excluded, and then justify that. The final aspect of the informed consent process is voluntariness. So there are obstacles to making a voluntary decision, and we heard some of those earlier, but generally those obstacles are poor information, being rushed to make a decision, being asked by somebody in a position of power or influence, or potentially cannot afford to take part. And those are all things that have been raised in our discussion so far, interestingly. There are, attempts to remedy these things that you could try and remove. So things like making sure you've got adequate information clearly explained, being given sufficient time and space to decide to participate, often a minimum of 24 hours. And this can include encouraging participants to discuss their involvement with trusted family and friends, ensuring the request to participate comes from a neutral party and in a private setting helps to address issues of power and influence, and also thinking about expenses, equipment, or other kind of benefits that you could be providing. Nadia, did you want to come on this?
No, I just wanted to ask, is there a minimum time which needs to be given to the participants? And then you said 24 hours, so I lowered my hand.
Well, I mean, there isn't a set minimum, and I think it depends on the type of study that you're asking them to participate in and the level of risk. If you're asking somebody simply to participate in a short, qualitative interview about their experiences of a new health facility, I'm not sure you need to give them 24 hours to consider whether, whereas if you're asking them to participate in a trial or something like that, then you need to think about these other elements. Probably, I'm actually sorry. Go on, Nadia.
I know one of the things which was happening is that the people they give their consent, then they are randomized, and then for example, if they are randomized into the intervention arm, then they change their mind and they stop, they don't come even to receive first session. So I was thinking that it's important if we really give them time so that they can discuss with their families and then give the consent, so that we don't have that 25% dropouts who have not even received.
And I think this again, Nadia, comes down often to cultural norms. If you've got somebody in your home asking you to participate in something, I think it's more difficult in sort of the cultures in South Asia to say no. In the UK, we're a lot more comfortable with saying no, thank you. I'm not able to do that. So that's another element to definitely be considering. And yes, often having a bit of time can help. It probably won't mitigate it altogether, but it may well help. And if you find people are avoiding you, that probably tells you that they're not quite willing to take part.
Another thing, sorry, I don't know how much time you. So what's happening is, for example, if there is a participant who was supposed to receive the sessions, and then our research therapists, they give them the phone call, but there is no response, then they tend to give phone call the next day, then the following day. So I was thinking that maybe this is ethically not good, because then it sounds as if we are forcing them. So maybe send them a message and then followed by one call, and that should be the end. But
I think it's very important to draw boundaries around that, around the timeline, around what you will do. And I think actually what you're suggesting sounds appropriate. Perhaps you could follow up with a phone call one day later, leave a message of some description that says, I will try you again in 2 days, phone them back then, and if they don't respond, then that's it, and you stop contacting. It's a discussion we've been having, trying to recruit healthcare workers at the moment. Obviously, they're very busy as a result of COVID and non-COVID care, and kind of striking that balance between how many times do we email them after they've said, I want to take part, to try and set something up, because if they're not responding to us, that probably is an indication they're just not in a position to take part, even if they would like to.
But what is happening is that when they keep on trying, the person do come, but then is that ethically right? How many times they need to be contacted? There is no hard and fast rule. You can make your own rule as you go along.
Yeah, there isn't a hard and fast, but I think, as you're saying, Nadia, it's that gut feeling. Is what I'm doing, does this feel like it's acceptable? If and the other useful way to think about it is, I heard this term in my PhD, self-ethics. If you were the one being called, how would you feel? Would you feel like this was verging now on harassment, or would you feel like this was okay? And so kind of thinking about it from that perspective can help.
That's a very, very, very good question. I'll be using that in my supervision. Thanks.
And Pragya, you've asked about the visualization of informed consent. Absolutely, yes. And there are ways. I'm going to share an example of some useful informed consent materials that I've seen recently. But you could, for example, also use tablets with short videos or PowerPoint presentations or things like that, ways that kind of make the process a little bit more interactive and a little bit more visual. And again, this is something to think through with who you will be researching with and your target population group to kind of go through with them. Okay. Okay, so proof of consent is where we were up to. So often this involves the signature on an informed consent form, but actually COVID has demonstrated that the signature output can be more difficult in some circumstances, like online research. And again, relevant for the sort of settings you are working in is potentially illiteracy or language barriers or physical barriers that mean that signing an informed consent form can be difficult. So alternatives in this context can be used. So for example, having an online consent form or audio recording verbal consent. Now, if you're thinking about going down this route, then do make sure that the file with any identifiable information is separate from interview or other data. And another one is witness consent. Just be aware, this is not person B consenting for person A, but person B attesting to person A having been given all of the information and making their own informed decision about participation and agreeing to that. So that's an important distinction around what witnessed consent means. It means somebody has independently verified that the individual consenting has indeed had all the information provided, has asked their questions and has voluntarily agreed on their own back to take part in that research. Oh, my slides have stopped. There we go. And just to emphasize, the process of consent is a lot more than just getting a signature itself. The signature simply provides some evidence that it's happened. Now, I'm going to switch here just to do something that hopefully is a bit more interesting, which is to watch a short video of an informed consent process. So I'm just switching my share screen and I'm going to play this for us to watch. I hope you can all see it. And just as this is playing, just to think about the informed consent process and that the things about this that you would consider to be appropriate or not appropriate in the provision of information. Krishani, so verbal consent equally as acceptable as written informed consent. Now, this is one that's often quite difficult. I would say yes. The challenge with verbal consent often is ethical review boards and the committees who essentially have an idea that consent is only consent if it's written. Ethically, that's not the case. Procedurally, that's a slightly different question. So again, I would go back and speak to your supervisors about what is acceptable within your local setting. I can confirm that I have been involved in studies that use both verbal and written consent in different contexts, depending on the population. So, you know, the study we're doing at the moment online in the UK with healthcare workers and managers and members of the public has all been verbal consent, which has been provided in individual audio files that we have kept separate to any of our interview data. And similarly, for a study that we're doing in an Indigenous community in Colombia, we are looking at verbal consent. And in fact, that's community level consent for some activities because of the way in which the Indigenous communities are structured and how kind of processes of consent work. And then there will be some individual level consent for specifically taking part in an instrument adaptation and validation study. Because the nature of the risks and what we're asking people to do is slightly different. So those are some examples of where you perhaps need to be thinking about what the study involves and what's an appropriate approach to gaining consent in a given context. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this video, which we're just going to watch for a couple of minutes. I'm going to turn my video off whilst this is playing.
Anna, there isn't I can't hear the video's audio. Can anybody else hear it, or is it just me?
We
No,
can't hear either.
Right. So perhaps Anna, you'll have to go and look at the settings. Anna, can you hear me? Hi, Anna. Can you hear me?
Anna has gone for a
Okay,
short.
sorry, I've just
Hi, Anna.
seen that you can't hear any sound.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So you'll
Okay.
have to perhaps go into your settings and enable there's a bit of a,
Settings here.
I think in your what's it called? We're on Zoom. So Zoom settings,
Okay, share sound.
share sound. Exactly.
Let's try that again. Can you hear it
You
now?
have cancer.
Yes, now we can hear it.
Bearing, you have
Thanks.
advanced metastatic ovarian.
Okay, no problem. My apologies for that, everybody. We'll start it again. There we go.
You have cancer. Miss Bearing, you have advanced metastatic ovarian cancer.
Go on.
You are a professor, Miss Bearing.
Like yourself, Dr. Kalikian.
Ah, yes. Now then, you present with a growth that unfortunately went undetected in stages 1, 2, and 3. Now it is an insidious adenocarcinoma.
Insidious.
Insidious means undetectable at an early stage.
Insidious means treacherous.
Shall I continue?
Oh, by all means.
Good. In invasive epithelial carcinoma, the most effective treatment modality is a chemotherapeutic agent. We are developing an experimental combination of drugs designed for primary site ovarian with a target specificity of stage 3 and beyond administration. Am I going too fast?
No.
You will be hospitalized as an inpatient for treatment each cycle. After the initial 8 cycles, you will have another battery of tests. The antineoplastic will inevitably affect some healthy cells, including those lining the gastrointestinal tract from the lips to the anus and the hair follicles. We will, of course, be relying on your resolve to withstand some of the more pernicious side effects. Miss Bearing?
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Do you have any questions so far?
Please go on.
Perhaps some of these terms are new?
No. You're being very thorough.
I make a point of it, and I always emphasize it with my students.
Oh, so do I. Thoroughness, I always tell my students, but they are constitutionally averse to painstaking work.
Yours too.
Oh, it's worse every year.
Well, mine are blind.
Oh, well, mine are deaf.
You just have to hope.
I suppose so.
Where were we, Dr. Perry?
I believe I was being thoroughly diagnosed.
Right. Now, the tumor is spreading very quickly, and this treatment is very aggressive. So far, so good?
Yes.
Better not teach next semester.
Out of the question.
The first week of each cycle, you'll be hospitalized for chemotherapy. The next week, you may feel a little tired. The next 2 weeks will be fine, relatively.
It's 8 months like that.
This treatment is the strongest thing we have to offer you. And as research, it'll make a significant contribution to our knowledge.
Knowledge. Yes.
Here is the informed consent form. Should you agree, you sign there at the bottom. Is there a family member you want me to explain this to?
Oh, that won't be necessary.
Good. The The important thing is for you to take the full dose of chemotherapy. There may be times when you'll wish for a lesser dose due to the side effects, but we've got to go full force. Dr. Barry?
Yes.
You must be very tough. Do you think you could be very tough?
You needn't worry.
Good. Excellent.
Okay, so that was an informed consent video, supposedly. I'm wondering if I can just invite you to think about what are the ways in which the consent process in the video could be improved. And there are quite a few. You can either unmute yourself or just pop some comments in the chat box. Nadia?
I would like, if anybody else wants to comment before me, I can wait.
Yes, Nadia, perhaps Nabi unmuted his mic. So Nabi.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, just in my view, like, this is the first time the patient is informed about her disease. So she was shocked. So probably should be given some more time to think and then decide. It's like, in a very hushed. And she didn't even carefully read what is written in the consent form, though she was explained by the doctor. But still, I think she should be given some more time to decide, and at least accept the news first.
Absolutely, yes, yeah, and I think there's an important dynamic here again, as we heard earlier, about the person asking for the consent. And in this particular context, given that she's just been informed that she has ovarian cancer, an advanced form of that, that's often something that's a very gendered as well, that experience, what that might be like. Would she feel comfortable asking a male individual about some of the potentially more, he calls them more pernicious side effects? I'm not really sure what that means. If you watch the film, you kind of learn what those are. But yes, that's a conversation that perhaps would be more appropriate to have with another female, and possibly another female of a kind of lower level of status, so that you felt a little bit more comfortable discussing what actually the implications of this diagnosis are for your body and your experience. We've got a couple of comments as well. So terminology is being simpler, absolutely. And the language that he uses throughout are very technical. Prasantha, you've said exactly the same. And be more elaborative on the side effects, 100%, yes. He talks about the side effects as being inevitable, and he's relying on her resolve to cope with them. But we don't know what they are, and neither does she. Yes, Krisani, absolutely. He's very he's approaching it as a job. He's not approaching it from an empathetic position at all, and that really does show. And he keeps referring back to her status and her position as being a reason for why she would be somebody who takes her resolve to cope with all of these. He also refers to the research component of the treatment to make it sound like she's there for experimentation rather than for care. And actually, she's just been given a very complex diagnosis. And, the aim of this should be, to make her experience, hopefully, a comfortable one, rather than necessarily for her to simply give herself up for knowledge generation. And yes, as has been highlighted, the consent form is handed over with an instruction of where to put the signature, rather than, would you like to read this and ask me any questions? And as was highlighted initially, with a very difficult diagnosis, is this character played by Emma Thompson, is she in a position to take the information in and sign that form, given what she's just been told? Does she have full capacity, essentially? And later in the play, she actually talks about the need for kindness rather than smartness. And I think that really picks up, Krishani, on what you were saying around the need for empathy and being humane in this encounter. So Nadia, did you want to add anything?
No, he continued giving the information after she signed the consent. So there was one last bit of information which he added after the consent form was signed. And then he was referring to her as a very strong person. So she was already given that status, which might stop her from asking any questions. And there wasn't any information sheet which was given along with the consent form. And of course, no time. She has to sign the consent there and then. So very sad.
So it's a very problematic consent process, essentially. But I think it's a useful one for really highlighting where all of those aspects could be improved, and really just coming back to those core principles of voluntariness, of the information being given, and of capacity. I'm very
sorry.
And just
go ahead.
Sorry, Nadia. I think it's also important to, when you're doing especially interventions, you need to know and state what the alternatives are.
Yeah.
So there is one alternative, that you don't take this, and then what will happen?
Yeah.
If you take this, at the end of the day, what might happen? So I think there's a huge chunk missing in all of the discourse that he was taking.
Mm-hmm. And you did mention about the gender thing, that the person needs to be, I don't know how much I agree with that, because professionally she could have asked him the questions, provided that he would have given her the space. So I don't know.
Yes, it's certainly, and I think that probably comes down to an individual and what they prefer. But I think it's the combination of the power dynamics of his gender, his status, and the way that he views her. All of those things combine potentially to inhibit her asking questions. Whereas, if she was speaking, I mean, even physically being sat behind a big desk, all of that sort of context shapes how that information is provided and what he's asking. But yes, the gender thing is open to, I'm very conscious of the time, so I want to go through this procedural ethical review elements from a Liverpool perspective, and then we're going to take a bit of a break, and we'll come back to consider some elements of kind of reflexivity, which will lead quite nicely into the epistemological session. So I'll just try and balance those two. So I wanted to highlight the ethical procedures that you're going to need to think about for your study. So 2 types of approval that you're going to require. The first one is the international approval. So that will be provided at your local research site. And the second one will be the University of Liverpool. And that is the order in which you will obtain them. So you obtain approval locally first, and then you submit that to the University of Liverpool. They look at all of the approvals that you have received from a local review committee, and they confirm that they also agree with the decisions of the local committee. I've included on this slide, and these are also on your reading list, some links to decision-making tools and guidance for assessing what types of approvals that you need, as well as these useful email contacts. Now, as you can see on the international research one, there is also a contact there for sponsorship. This is something that you might require in addition to ethical approval. It's very important that you double check that before you apply for any ethical approval. So you can drop an email to sponsor. Often they like to see a copy of your protocol, and they will look at that and decide whether University of Liverpool sponsorship is something that they also need to provide. It really depends on the study design and approach as to whether that is needed or not. And sponsoring a study, just to confirm what that is, it is essentially where an organization, in this case Liverpool, takes responsibility for confirming there are proper arrangements to initiate, monitor, manage and finance a study. So it's just them confirming that they take responsibility for those sides of things. I really encourage you, if you've got any questions or you're struggling with anything, to email the two contacts that I've got here. So the ethics one is the University of Liverpool Research Ethics team, and they can help with the kind of content of the ethical approval. They can also help you if you're struggling with navigating the online form, because for University of Liverpool Ethics now, it's submitted through an online form, which you will be able to access through your Liverpool logins. And as I say, the sponsorship team as well, please do reach out to them. So some very brief recommendations is to look at the resources, the templates, etc., that are recommended by Liverpool and the Health Research Authority. Do be aware that Liverpool have what I consider to be some overly zealous templates for informed consent processes and information. They are very keen on GDPR and all these sorts of requirements. So please do have a look at those to ensure that you meet their standards, but don't be afraid to adapt them to your purposes. For example, often what we do in studies is we have the very detailed information sheet, and then we create a script for our researchers, to go through that's much more accessible. And this is where you can think about using alternative formats to make the content more accessible, to focus in on those key pieces of information. But you're still kind of ticking the University of Liverpool box for this horrible table that they insist you put in for GDPR requirements, which, yeah. Also make sure that everything that you're thinking about ethically, that you justify it in your researcher. So that, you know, you're not just saying that you're going to do X, you're doing X because of Y. Try and put yourself in the position of the participant. So again, as I was saying earlier, this idea of self-ethics, how might you feel about being participated in the study? And please do double check the basics. Look at spell checking, look at formatting, look that things are well written. Otherwise, you're going to get ethical review committees sending things back for things that really have absolutely nothing to do with ethics. And these are some examples here of example recruit and consent materials from study conducted by a student on the doctorate in clinical psychology here at Liverpool. And I think these are a nice example of how these materials can be much more engaging and accessible through the use of images, colors, subheadings, etc. So these are nice examples that really, again, emphasize that don't be afraid to amend the templates in ways that you feel will make them more appropriate for your participant group. You know, in some studies, written forms are absolutely fine. They're totally acceptable, and your participants will be able to engage with them well. In other studies, more creative methods are beneficial. So just thinking that through, I would definitely encourage and again, play with these things, work with people that you know who are good at graphic drawing and design and things like that is always a good idea.
In one of the studies, we were also thinking of making a small video of the information sheet. So that rather than giving the information sheet, you show that video to people and help them understand that what the study is about. So you can be innovative, I believe.
Yeah, well, and that's also a way of, that's also been tried as a way to standardize so that everybody is getting exactly the same information because it's a video, rather than, of course, if it's an individual researcher reading something out, the way in which they read it, the way in which they might answer questions, you know, that all kind of differs each participant. So that's something certainly that you can consider. Okay. So I was going to sort of encourage some individual reflection. I'm very conscious that we're running way over time. So I'm going to give us a break. I think it would be beneficial for everybody to step away, stand up, go and grab a drink or a snack or whatever. We'll take 10 minutes. So if we come back here at 10:45 a.m. it is for me. I'm afraid I can't do the maths in my head for all your different time zones, but 10 minutes, we'll see you back here. And if you've got any questions or things that you want me to pick up on in the next session, please do just chuck those in the chat. Okay?
What to do in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
See you shortly. Okay, that is 10 minutes that have flown by. Can I check people are back? There we go. See how I'm saying to raise your hand once you're back. Lots of raised hands, which is always good. Okay, shall we resume then? So I'm going to pick up briefly just to cover some research in practice considerations, which obviously picks up on that that distinction that we had a little bit earlier on. So really thinking about issues of researcher integrity and the wider socio-political context on research and the underpinning ethical considerations. So just highlighting here some key aspects of researcher integrity, which is becoming talked about more and more at the moment within academia more broadly, particularly in the UK. There has been a lot of research happening by the UK Research and Innovation, which brings together all of the Research Council funding bodies, as well as by Wellcome, which are another big funding body in the UK. And a lot of this focuses on research culture and ensuring that researchers are provided with an environment that actually incentivizes integrity and avoids research falsification or questionable research practices, or as we've seen, kind of ensures that people are responding to research in practice tensions ethically. So integrity is very broad. It's understood as practicing in accordance with an ethical compass and to be aware of and responding to ethical issues as they arise. And the key values, as you can see here, are around honesty, rigor, transparency, open communication, care and respect for those involved in research, and accountability for a positive research environment. In terms of researcher integrity, there are challenges to achieving this often. These can be they can be a whole range of things, and many of these are everyday pressures, things that I am sure you guys are very familiar with, things like time and resource pressures. I would challenge any of you not to be encountering those during the conduct of a PhD study. And as we've been highlighting as well, ethical practice versus governance challenges, and also thinking about the sort of pressures that you are under as an academic, pressures to publish, for example. So these are all things that can challenge our integrity on a day-to-day basis, and it's just important to be aware of these. These aren't necessarily things that we're going to get rid of, but we can be aware of these pressures and how we respond to them and ensure that our response is in line with an ethical compass. One of the key things that I'd like to highlight is researcher preparedness, and ensuring that you as the researchers and any research assistants you're going to be working with are trained and supported to implement your study methods successfully. Again, this comes back to ensuring research benefits, as well as being prepared to understand and maintain professional boundaries. It is also an ethical responsibility to make sure that our equipment is in good working order and that any specialist training in, for example, administering tools or tests is completed. We have been picking up on self-care quite a bit in our discussions already, and just to re-emphasize that supervision is really important. Debriefing, group support can be really helpful. And this kind of cohort of enhanced fellows is a really useful forum for having these sort of reflective discussions and supporting one another. particularly when you're hearing or analysing difficult experiences or stories, which can take an emotional toll on you as the researcher. Also, thinking about exit plans. So this could be exiting a particular interview or bringing the study to a close, which can involve a suitable ending where the study potentially has led to relationships being built between the researcher and certain communities or research participants. So thinking for and planning for that is also quite important. So throughout your study, obviously your supervisors should always be your first point of call if you're concerned about any aspects of your research conduct and the pressures that you're facing. They are well aware of the demands of a PhD study and they are there to support you through this process. So please do draw upon them. And then the final point that I just wanted to highlight was reflective practice, and we're going to pick up on this a little bit more in the next session, but it's important both methodologically and ethically to be thinking reflexively, particularly in a qualitative the qualitative research paradigm. This is often talked about a lot more, but it's essential whether you're doing a qualitative or a quantitative study. And it can involve both reflection with your stakeholders, it can involve reflection from your participants, so asking them about their experiences of participating in your study, and it can also be self-reflection using things, a number of tools and approaches, which I'll come on to shortly. So that really concludes the thinking about ethical aspects. I have, if you've looked at the slides that I put up and shared with you, I have, I'm afraid, ducked out of a couple of more interactive elements. So there was a dilemma game and there are a couple of case studies. We just simply haven't had time for those because the discussions have taken over. However, they've illustrated the same points. So I'm going to leave those, but if you do want to have a look at them, please do. Obviously the slides are in PebblePad, so do have a little look and see what you can take away from thinking through those essentially thought experiments. Okay, I'm going to stop these slides and switch over. Whilst I'm doing that, if you've got any questions or comments on the ethics side of things, I'm happy to hear those now.
So I was wondering about the researcher's position because some of the study designs requires you to have certain number of participants, and sometimes the integrity might be compromised because there's this time limit and also the pressure to reach so and so number of participants. So like any suggestions how we can, go around it?
That's a very important one, and that is one that I think every researcher at some point faces. So it's thinking about your planning and your preparedness. It's thinking about the minimum sample that will allow you to learn what you need to learn, and it's thinking about the strategies that you have for engaging your target participants. The final point is to recognize that if you are really encountering massive issues in recruiting and there just is not engagement, then listening to what that's telling you. Why are people not engaging? What are the opportunities for what you could learn there that might help you either to revise the approach that you're taking or to take a step back and to revise the study and to do something slightly different? There's no, as with many of these things, there's no clear-cut correct or incorrect answer, I'm afraid. And the answer definitely isn't just phone all your mates and get them to take part so that you reach your quota, but it is, just thinking about what's within your control that you can do, what are the strategies you can put in place to try and encourage recruitment, to try and engage people. What potentially could you learn by speaking to your experts by experience or your steering committee about why people are not confident in participating in the study, and what revisions maybe you could make to encourage that? Those are certainly the initial strategies to take. And then obviously if things are getting more complicated, then it's one definitely to take back to your supervisors and to think about whether you need to be reorienting some of what you're looking at achieving to make it more manageable within the timelines. Okay.
Anna, just a quick question. Like, for using the topic guides, we pilot test them. I think it's also a good idea to pilot test the information sheet and the consent form just to make sure that people are actually understanding it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was something that we mentioned earlier. So either pilot testing it with participants or with your steering committee or something like that. And again, if you are able to do things like this, then make sure that you tell the Research Ethics Committee that that's something that you've done, that these materials have been piloted and that they have been deemed to be acceptable by your research participants, because that's a really important point to highlight, that you're thinking about that. Okay, I'm going to cover now some key considerations around epistemology in qualitative research in particular, but also applies to both paradigms, qualitative and quantitative, for the kind of conduct of research more broadly. I am, sorry, excuse me. I am running over time, so I am going to have to say now that we may have to run over a little bit towards the end of this session. We might not be finishing bang on 12 o'clock, but I'm going to try and do my best to keep us on time as much as I can. Okay, so the learning objectives for this morning are to think about what epistemology refers to. So think about the relationship between epistemology, your theoretical frameworks or positions, your methods, approaches to analyses, and understand why it's important that these cohere with one another. Understand the importance of examining and engaging in positionality and reflexivity, and there's a couple of exercises we're going to do in relation to that. And then also I'm going to share with you some tools and approaches to enhance consideration of positionality and application of reflexive approaches. Now, the really big thing that I want to emphasize is that this is very much an introductory session. It is impossible to do justice to the diversity of epistemological positions and the myriad of debates around epistemology in a short sort of hour-long session. So the aim of today is really to emphasize the interconnectedness of the different parts of your research and how epistemology can help act as a glue to tie things together. And again, to foreground for you that thinking about and engaging actively with epistemological considerations is an expectation in a PhD thesis. So this is something that you need to try and get your heads around and ensure that you're engaging with. The final thing to take away is that this is something that hopefully we will start a conversation around today. And again, additional self-directed learning and in-depth discussions with your supervisors are highly recommended to take things forward. Okay, so just very briefly going to recap the boundaries around quantitative, qualitative and mixed methods research, particularly given that that's a broad focus for those of you, well, all of you. So really highlighting here the quantitative paradigm and the basic assumptions around the ideas of objectively quantifiable and measurable aspects to social life, really thinking about hypotheses, looking to either verify or falsify those, and then looking towards empirical generalization through, for example, sample sizes. The goals of these types of studies are generally to understand cause and effect or test hypotheses, and the focus is around numeric measurement and generalizability through statistical methods. So then thinking about qualitative research, which obviously has a slightly different assumption, which essentially comes down to the fact that multiple views are possible about a social phenomena that we might be investigating. The approach is from broad general questions, to views of a range of relevant participants, to think about descriptive and interpretive themes, and then to think about the meaning about what it is we've heard and been told to specific groups and individuals. The goals are generally a fuller understanding of a phenomena, so unpacking these ideas of cause and effect, or what an experience is like, and potentially then to look to develop causal hypotheses. Often people assume that qualitative research doesn't look to generalize, whereas actually if you are adopting certain stances that accept that there are certain kind of rules that adhere across a population group, so certain types of experiences that then can lead to sort of theoretical understanding of what something is like for a group of people, then there is an element of generalizability that's built in there. This is often how qualitative and quantitative paradigms are compared. It is, as you can see in the title there, an overstated distinction between these two paradigms. So generally, qualitative research is seen as exploring what is a phenomena and how does that vary in different circumstances and why, inductive approach, moving from an understanding of society to a hypothesis about it, rather than the quantitative approach, which is hypothesis testing or deductive. Now, this is a reduction of the two paradigms, which hides some very important issues. In particular, it's incorrect to assume that, as I was just saying, qualitative research is not interested in the generalizable and quantifiable and only interested in the particular. Our entire social world is full of qualitative phenomena that are not random, but that actually are organized around rules and norms, which are often the object of study in qualitative research. What happens frequently holds for the majority of people. And therefore, in this way, qualitative research can and often is interested in commonly held views or experiences. And this is just one example of where the kind of distinctions between these two paradigms can fall down a little bit. Another area of contention in the presentation of qualitative and quantitative is often this suggestion that they are in an epistemological battle, with quantitative seen to be searching for objectively verifiable truth, whereas qualitative focuses on subjective understanding. And this demarcation can actually be really problematic because it discourages the two paradigms working together. And this means that researchers on either side of the fence can be unaware of the contributions from people from the different paradigms or from different disciplines to their same research topic. And it can also fail to recognize the benefits of mixed methods research. So this comes from one of the papers that I circulated, and in implementation research in particular, it can be important to combine methods from each paradigm in order to fully explore a research question. There are a number of ways of approaching this combination of methods. As you can see here, the convergent parallel, the explanatory sequential, and the exploratory sequential designs, which position qualitative and quantitative data analysis in slightly different positions along the research journey in order to answer a very specific research question. They highlight, in particular, Curry et al., 4 areas of attention when conducting mixed methods research. The first is ensuring that the study aims, methods, and research team capacity are aligned. The second is paying deliberate attention to adherence to methodological standards for each component in line with relevant disciplinary conventions. The third is having a strategy for integrating the qualitative and the quantitative components, resulting in one coherent study rather than 2 parts that stand alone. So the mixed methods and the implementation research approach aims to actually bring findings together to tell a bigger story rather than look at these as 2 very discrete pieces of work that don't necessarily speak to one another. And the final recommendation that they have is following standards for reporting mixed method studies, ensuring that sufficient methodological detail is provided for each component. This is a quote from Martin Hammersley, who essentially here hopes to highlight that when we are engaging the complexities and we are engaging with the complexities of lived social realities, we recognize that when we want to understand or measure facets of experience or what they think, we need to be careful to really think through how best to access this information. As Hammersley kind of makes the point here, making the right choice is critical for the reliability of our research findings and the contribution to knowledge more broadly. So essentially the point here is that each research paradigm is only as meaningful as the research problem and question that you are seeking to address. And so really thinking through how can you best address the specific question you have and which method is best suited to that is absolutely critical. So I'm going to turn now just to focus a little bit on more explicitly on the qualitative research paradigm. Which essentially looks to explore natural settings. So the social, cultural and experiential aspects of medicine. It has a subjective orientation. So looking at, this doesn't mean necessarily that we are looking at a subjectivist approach, i.e. that everybody's experience is unique. It does recognize the commonalities in those experiences. But the key is to understand these intersubjectivities, how people relate to one another, such as a doctor-participant relationship, for example. Also looking at social practices and the role of social structures and norms in shaping human practice and behavior. This can include exploring things such as the role of culture, state, medical institutions, etc. In kind of shaping health and medicine. It can include studying cultural objects, texts, discourses, you know, that emerge in laboratories or in other types of settings. And overall, adopting this subjective orientation to these issues helps us to unpack the way in which knowledge and understanding is produced and maintained. So this is, i.e., how our social world is built up and established. The main thing that I'd like you to take away when we're thinking about qualitative research is that it is actually the idea of a qualitative method specifically is quite an unhelpful catch-all term that obscures the range of different approaches that are adopted within a qualitative paradigm. It's not one thing. Qualitative research is not one way of doing things. It is a broad church of methodologies, of techniques, of strategies, of approaches that is informed by lots of different disciplines and is frequently evolving. And again, it comes back to this point that Hammersley was making around ensuring that the approach that you are taking is appropriate to the specific question and the specific problem that you're looking to address. Okay, so that's just a bit of background context. We're now going to think a little bit more about this relationship between ontology, epistemology, methodology, and methods. So these are lots of big terms. Don't panic if these are not necessarily things that you've come across before. But essentially, the point is that all studies should cohere across these different elements and considerations. So your study's epistemological position generally will inform the methodology and the methods and your approach to analysis, as we'll see. So qualitative research relies on some underpinning philosophical concerns. So ontology relates to the nature of being and what can be known, what a phenomena is. So essentially the answer to the question, what is reality? Epistemology is understood as a theory of knowledge, how we can come to know something. So how we can come to know it and where we can access that. Methodology is thinking about how you put your epistemology into practice. So how do you orient to your objective research? It defines how you see a phenomena, whether it's a thing, whether it's a social fact, or whether it's something that emerges in practice between people. And then the methods are the tools that we apply, how we go about finding something out. This comes from the reading that I shared, Moon and Blackman, which provides a really nice overview of ontology and epistemology in qualitative research. So it tries to summarize. It doesn't capture absolutely everything, which is another reason for emphasizing that we can't cover all of this in an hour. But it does capture many of the main traditions when it comes to qualitative research paradigms. So as they highlight in their paper, philosophy provides the general principles of theoretical thinking, a method of cognition, perspective, and self-awareness, all of which are used to obtain knowledge of reality and to design, conduct, analyze, and interpret research and its outcomes. So in particular, they emphasize the importance of recognizing and appreciating the different philosophical positions from which research can be conducted for their influence on what knowledge is generated and how this knowledge shapes and informs subsequent practice. And you will see I put an emphasis on that in particular, this idea of the knowledge that we are generating will inform subsequent practice. That is the space in which we are all researching. You know, when we are looking to do the sort of work that we're doing, we are thinking about how can I support particular groups of people to receive particular types of interventions and ways of caring for people that will be of benefit to them. And recognizing that these are shaped by these background assumptions that we are all bringing to a research study is a really important component of that, because it may well direct us towards particular types of solutions. And recognizing that is important for the journey that we're going on.
So Anna, I think this is where you need to go a bit slowly. So what you have just mentioned, that is the theoretical perspective, isn't it?
Yes.
That we are all doing our research because we want to, sorry, can you just repeat the last few sentences which you said?
These were things off the top of my head, Nadia. You're asking me to just pop it. But yes, essentially, we are driven to do research for particular reasons. We are looking to, you know, certainly in the conversations that I've had with enhanced fellows so far, people are driven by a desire to improve the lives of certain groups of people, and to do that by addressing certain mental health challenges that they may well be experiencing. And those are addressed in very specific ways. And a lot of that is shaped by our prior underpinning philosophical frameworks, our underpinning ontologies about how we understand what is going on in the world and how we understand and appreciate the sort of knowledge that's coming out, and then apply that in our own research study.
Okay, thank you. One thing which I really find confusing in qualitative research is there are different terms which are used for the same thing.
Yes.
I think you must have noticed that as well. And that can be confusing, because when I was doing my PhD, this is something which really
it can be really confusing. And the one thing that I really struggle with is often people are not explicit about their epistemological position when they're writing up research findings. And so you can actually only see their position through the way in which they approach a question and the way in which they analyze data. So that's something else to keep an eye on. And it is, I'm not here to say that this is particularly an easy aspect of kind of getting to this level of research. However, it is a really important one to really try and engage with and to think about, because of the way in which it, you know, we're coming back to some of the earlier slides that we were looking at around integrity and things like that, transparency. It comes back to who you are as a researcher. And the more transparent you can be about the approaches that you're using and the position from which you are conducting research, the more I feel your research can be objectively assessed by other researchers in the same field, and your contribution to knowledge becomes a lot more explicit. Sihan.
Very, very quickly, just for the sake of us all, especially fellows, it's always helpful, I'm speaking for myself, it's always helpful for me to pick up an example to try and pin on, say, for example, I'm taking this epistemological perspective. How am I acquiring this knowledge, which I am calling knowledge? So many of the fellows within their settings they have a sort of a broad canvas from which the knowledge is being acquired. Yeah. And say, Najia, for example, when we were developing this very recent, the tech-assisted Thinking Healthy program, so you assembled a fairly large group of users to try and acquire a methodology by which what you end up saying that this needs to be done for this tech-assisted app is the knowledge, which is now from multiple sources. So you've already taken quite a bit of methodological steps to ensure that whatever you end up saying knowledge comes from a process. And you've, from the outset, taken this perspective that you want to create an application which is informed by all that sort of knowledge which the users will bring to the table. So it's always helpful for me to have a concrete example which I may have been applying. I may not be using these terms, but I'm using these principles of epistemology, of creating knowledge. It's a science of knowledge. How do you know that this is knowledge? This is not just Seham, whimsical ideas. Although in my opinion, there aren't any whimsical ideas. I, as a person, will always be informed by my experiences, my read up, my interaction. So nothing is actually whimsical. It's just the transparency and the method that you bring to the fore. So I'll stop here.
So for
Absolutely.
Sorry,
go on,
just
Nadia.
for the THP app development, we use the human-centered approach. So there is an approach which we use. So sorry, you continue.
No, yeah, I was going to pick up on that actually, Nadia, because yeah, I think that there are a number of things that come into play there, because obviously with the human-centered design approach, you are looking then particularly to, I would argue, probably relying on a sort of phenomenological epistemology there, because you are looking at participants' experience. What is it like to have X, and what is it like to interact with a certain type of technological approach to help address that? So that to me comes down to a very experiential level. It is, however, underpinned by some slightly different epistemologies that have led you, I think, to the point at which technology has become the answer. So, you know, there's quite a lot going on when you start to unpack some of these things. The key takeaway is that whatever you choose is to try and really seek to understand that, and seek to ensure that your study coheres as a result of that underpinning epistemological position. And we will also get on a little bit later to picking up, Siham, some of those other things that you're talking about around kind of what it is you're reading, who you are, where you're socially located, all of these other things that come into play, kind of your positionality really as a researcher, that also shapes what it is that you're conducting. So this is another kind of summary slide that covers some of the core philosophical traditions, which are down there on the left: positivism, interpretivism, social constructionism, and critical theorists. So it's a very brief overview. And again, I'm sharing this to emphasize the diversity of approaches. Qualitative research is a broad church, and the same method can be used from a different philosophical position. So for example, interviews could be conducted from the position of a positivist, i.e., an interviewee will tell the truth, an objectively verifiable truth about what a given experience is like. An interpretivist would argue that an interviewee will tell the researcher about how people make sense of a specific experience in the context of their lives and their background social position. So that allows the development of ideas about how a group of people experience a given phenomena. From a social constructionist perspective, each interviewee provides an indication of each individual's experience of a given phenomena. And it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about what a group of people might experience something like. So this is a slightly crude kind of way of looking at it, but it's really important just to kind of recognize that there are these key traditions and these key assumptions that underpin what you're conducting. And again, here, going back to the diagram, again, the philosophical underpinning will actually shape many aspects of the research process. So for example, if you are interested in how somebody justifies their views on organ donation by a family member, you might adopt a perspective that takes a hermeneutic epistemology. That's one that prioritizes. Hermeneutics essentially means you prioritize language, how somebody justifies something, the linguistic tools that they use. And that would then suggest that the best way to explore how language justifies a position is through interviews or perhaps focus groups, where people are engaged in a deliberative justificatory process through the sort of questions you ask. And then when you're thinking about your analysis approach, again, you're interested in language and justification. So you might, for example, if you've done a focus group, use conversation analysis, which is a specific way to unpack and to analyze data that emphasizes how a position is justified in conversation with somebody else. And then when you're reporting your research, again, your focus is going to be on that justification process. You're not going to be saying whether organ donation is right or wrong. You're going to be saying how people understand and justify the decision to donate or not donate. So really that's an example that tries to emphasize how all of these elements of the design of your research are interrelated, and why the epistemological orientation is important, that consistency between epistemology, methods, analysis, and reporting. And this is something that does get picked up in examinations and in peer review journal articles as well. And so it is something that will be looked for as evidence of kind of your development as a researcher. Now, another aspect that I just want to pick up on is this idea of theory building in qualitative research. And really, theory is quite a confusing term, as Nadia was highlighting earlier. This is one that gets bandied around quite a lot and can be quite confusing in qualitative research, because some people think about theoretical lenses is what they would call what I've just been calling epistemological positions. For me, theory is slightly different. So theory can be used as a framework to kind of to guide a study, or it can be used in the analysis stage. And I'm just going to emphasize again that research is shaped by the researcher, your epistemology, your positionality, and these already contain certain theoretical orientations or insights. So as I was mentioning earlier, social science research often aspires to aims of social justice, which in turn can lead to some basic assumptions, such as the role of social determinants of health, including race, gender, economic status, etc., in shaping your mental health outcomes. And these are the types of theoretical lenses that can be brought to a study. So to give you some examples, thematic analysis, when I was integrating theory into my PhD research, I conducted a inductive thematic analysis of my qualitative interviews, and I noticed the tensions that I was sharing with you earlier around the way ethics is represented in written documents and the way that ethics happens in the field for field workers in practice. And this led me really back to the literature and to the underpinning theoretical lens of what's known as boundary objects, which is a theory that was developed by some people working in the US many years ago. And so I applied this theory to my data as a way to help understand and extend the analysis. Similarly, another example from a study that I've been conducting in Rwanda and Uganda with refugees, exploring what a good life means to them, our thematic analysis found a very strong gender component around appearance. And so this allowed to then examine our data through existing gender theories and models. So that's, for me, is one of the areas where you can get a very clear relationship between theory and your primary data. Another one is grounded theory, and I'm highlighting this because it's a very specific approach to qualitative research and has a methodological orientation that requires a specific way of doing interviews and analysis to inductively actually develop your own theory through the conduct of research. Grounded theory is often something that's bandied about and isn't necessarily done terribly well. So be conscious of that if you're reading grounded theory papers. But it involves this idea of abduction. So where the researcher grounds their insights very much in the data, and through specific attention in the data analysis process, they generate their own inductive theory for the specific problem that they are examining. So that's really just to highlight that studies can approach theory in different ways. Generally, a theoretical lens acts as a vehicle, and the idea is it helps to support or extend what it is that you're empirical, so that your raw data findings are telling you. Another just map here, which tries to highlight that this model really shows how theory can act at various stages. It can provide the foundations of your research, or it can be the pinnacle of a research study. And this article here by Collins and Stockton is a useful introduction to thinking about the role of theory in qualitative research. And it has lots of examples to highlight the role of theory across lots of different studies. So that's a nice paper to have a look at, just to help get your heads around that a little bit more. Okay, just a very brief exercise here. These are known as Gestalt images. I'm sure you're familiar with them, and they were developed as ways to demonstrate how the brain tries to make sense of the world. And I'll just give you a moment to have a look at them and see what it is you see in each of those 3 separate images. So just to unpack kind of what the purpose of this is that, so if we look at the image on the left, the Rubin vase, this is known as a bistable image. So it creates 2 different stable images, one of a vase and one of a pair of faces looking at one another. And it demonstrates how the brain can switch from seeing the world in one way to seeing the world in a completely different way. And in this process, this is where your mind is trying to make sense of the whole. It makes a leap from parts of the picture to an interpretation of what is going on. So the picture on the right, whether we see a saxophonist or a young woman's face, is informed by potentially our background assumptions, social positions, and exposure to things like a saxophonist playing. And this is a sort of challenge that's reflected in qualitative research. How can we interpret what someone's telling us so that what we're seeing is a reflection of what we've been observed or told, of what we've observed or been told? And it's important to really recognize that when we're studying the social world, we will inevitably make sense of it through our prior concepts. So through our prior understanding of the world, through what it is we have previously interacted with, what it is we have read, what it is we know about. One thing really that qualitative researchers agree about in relation to this problem for qualitative research is it's important that the researcher themselves reflects on their orientation to a particular object of study and is open about any biases or approaches they try to use to limit this informing what they see in data. And the aim of that is to increase the reliability of qualitative research. So this really gets us onto this question of positionality and reflexivity. Why are these things important? Well, the main thing to emphasize is that, as we've been hearing and as we've been discussing, kind of unpacking some of the ethical issues that arise in research, the research isn't the simple application of a procedure. There are significant skills involved in the way in which a researcher engages with their participants, engages with their data, makes judgments, and is constantly applying creativity in the conduct of their research. So the key idea here is that research is an active, engaged process in which the researcher needs to recognize their own influences on both what and how knowledge is generated. This is a fairly long quote, but I really liked it. I'll read through it. So reflexive researchers are researchers who, whatever else they may be exploring or measuring, are also prepared to make the project itself an object of study. In doing so, they accept that social science research is always and importantly an interpretive activity. Whatever aspect of reality is explored will always be reconstructed in the investigatory work and in the presentation of the outcomes. Reflexive researchers accept that no measurement, no observation, no account from interview subjects, no archival data have an unequivocal or unproblematic relationship to anything outside the empirical material. Acknowledgement is always made by a reflexive researcher that any study highlights only certain claims about the most accurate way to understand the particular situations, experiences, conditions, processes, etc. in the study, and leaves alternative explanations largely unexplored. This is from the Wren editorial, which is on the recommended reading. And really her key argument is that good reflexive research entails healthy skepticism about the possibility of value-free knowledge, particularly when we are looking at social and psychological realities. She draws attention to the fact that knowledge claims that we make on the basis of our research in turn have consequences for action in the practical social world, i.e., they warrant us pursuing certain types of practices, certain types of psychological interventions over others. So that's where her emphasis lies, on why it's important to be very aware of what it is we are choosing to explore and what it is we are choosing to leave unexplored. So some definitions. Positionality is defined as an individual's worldview, which encompasses things like our beliefs about the social world, what's knowable, so this idea of ontology, our beliefs about the nature of knowledge, which is this idea of epistemology, and then also how we interact with the social environment, so assumptions about human nature and agency. And these are underpinned by who we are as individuals, our values, our beliefs, and these are shaped by politics, religion, faith, gender, gender identity, ethnicity, social class, status, disability, ability, etc., etc., etc. So in a research context, it's important to kind of be thinking about all of these things that make up who we are as researchers. There's some other kind of writers who emphasize aspects of positionality. So Donna Haraway emphasizes the situated nature of positionality, here focusing on theoretical lenses, so our ontological and epistemological orientations. And specifically, she focuses in on the wider literature and the theories that underpin our understanding of the phenomena we are investigating. So exactly what Sihan was highlighting earlier. What we read informs how we think about a problem. There's also the insider and outsider position. So insider was originally understood to mean researching your own work organization. And it's now recognized to incorporate being a member of a community or having some sort of intimate knowledge of how a community operates. So recognizing that community is a very wide term. And an outsider was basically a researcher who comes from outside a group that they are studying. And it's generally accepted that both insider and outsider positions in research can yield useful and interesting insights. There are some epistemological orientations, so for example, phenomenology, and I'd recommend looking at Schutz's essay, The Stranger. This tension is directly explored as an aspect of the researcher orientation to their object of study, so through which they question and come to gain knowledge. So he, in his essay, really emphasizes the outsider position and the way in which you can approach a group of people as essentially a stranger, trying to learn about their social conventions and rules and norms within that setting. And more recently, there's been discussions about the gaze of the researcher, so who might be equipped to study certain topics. For example, it could be argued that only Black lesbian feminists should be able to study the experience of Black lesbian feminists, because only they will understand the various intersectionalities that come with that identity and therefore the experiences. I'm not altogether completely persuaded by those sorts of arguments, but I think that that is something to be aware of, the position of the researcher and where they sit in relation to a given population or topic. So I've got a little bit of an exercise here to help us think through our positionality. Generally, positionality is discussed into relation to a couple of core areas. So Holmes identifies the subject under investigation, the research participants, and the research process and context. I'm more familiar with the Wilkinson stuff below, thinking about your personal, professional, and disciplinary positionalities. Whatever approach you take, it's very valid, just important to consider your research topic and aspects of your positionality, then it might be important to examine in relation to how you're approaching your study. Now, the exercise I'm going to have us do is in relation to this, which is an identity mosaic, which is designed to help you think through various aspects of your personal and social identity. So I'll run through a bit of an example. So my PhD research, as I mentioned, involved me traveling to 3 countries in South Asia and speaking to researchers about their experiences and understanding of research ethics. And this raised certain elements of my positionality, including my first language, which is English. Whilst English is widely spoken and understood, it overlays with other aspects of my identity, such as my geographical location, as British English has certain colonial connotations in South Asia. And this is something I was very aware of prior to starting my research, and which was frequently raised by participants that I spoke to. Another aspect of my positionality that I had to actively negotiate in discussions with, in particular, more junior researchers was my educational background. More specifically, this related to how I was introduced and positioned with local research teams. So being introduced as an academic from Liverpool University led to very different reactions to when I was introduced as a student who had come to learn about their experiences. And it sounds obvious when you say it, but as we were highlighting earlier, power and positionality intersect with one another. And these things can interact to affect the data that's produced. When I was introduced as an academic from Liverpool, much more formal, I would find that participants were slightly more guarded about telling me things and were more likely to be looking to me to tell them that what they were telling me was right, which obviously wasn't the purpose of me speaking to them. I wanted to hear about their experiences because as far as I was concerned, they were the expert in what it was like to do things in their setting. Another aspect of my positionality that arose were very much related to my personal positionality. So my female gender, my youngish age, and they led to informal discussions and quite often advice about my marital status and intention to have children. These are not part of the research project, but they give an indication of how I was perceived by the people I was talking to, and the sort of cultural lenses they brought to these topics, which did come up in my research. So for example, my research was looking at research ethics, and the age of consent is a topic that comes up. Obviously, international ethical guidelines often stipulate over 18, sometimes 16, but that for participants felt incongruent, where girls are married not uncommonly at a much younger age. So as you can see, these examples really indicate how and where aspects of my positionality and those of my participants differed, and why thinking about these prior to research can help us to prepare for and inform how we might conduct a study. They may also help us to think through the things that participants chose to tell us and the way in which they explained things and the type of emphasis that they put on various aspects. So I was going to take a short break for maybe, well, if we go to 45 again, so the next 7 minutes, just so that you can have an opportunity to think about your own positionality. And the idea here is around a positionality statement. So a statement that captures the key aspects of your personal and social identity in relation to your research topic. So indicating hopefully how you're going to look to remain in dialogue with these different aspects of your positionality as your research evolves, how that might influence your research. And that's an important component of reflexivity, which we're going to come on to think about in a moment. So I will pause there and just give you a moment. Hopefully you've got a pen and a piece of paper, just to try and unpack some of the things that, the sort of things that I was highlighting. Does that sound okay? Is that clear?
That's really interesting. But there were a few other things which I thought that you are going to circle, but you didn't. For example, your cultural identity was different from your research participant. So was your other thing. I don't know which one was it. Appearance. Yes, appearance.
There would be a lot of things that I could have circled on there. I was just pulling out some initial things that were fairly obvious and fairly easy for me to highlight. But yes, I could probably go around everything on this identity mosaic, and I could identify how each of those things interacted with my study. It's just that those three particular ones stood out to me. But yes, cultural identity was a big one, and in fact, cultural identity often was considered through the lens of food. Always a good topic in my view.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'll give you 5 minutes or so just to consider, just to capture some notes before we move on. Okay. Does anyone want to share anything about how they found doing that, thinking about their positionality? Again, you can use the chat function or unmute yourself, whichever you're most comfortable with.
Just to, while the fellows sort of start writing or start to think how best to articulate, one thing that I immediately realized, I've never done this exercise before, so that's one disclosure. Not in this particular fashion, but yes, I've been involved in numerous research projects with perinatal as well as child participants, perinatal women and child participants. And what I very quickly realized looking at this identity mosaic is that as I aged, my positionality also changed. Because as I am progressing, I am one person who's constant, but I'm doing number of studies with either women, with children, with household members, with grandmothers, etc. But I am a constant who's aging, whose appearance is changing, whose educational background is changing, as the years sort of I progress. So what I took from this is that positionality statement might also change and evolve as I progress in experience and work. So I'll stop here. I just thought this was quite an interesting, so it's not fixed, not just with the participant, but by me as a constant. I'm also changing.
Absolutely. And I think wider things that happen within our lives also make a difference. So, I mean, coming back again, you can't get away from it, but COVID-19 means that you think about some of these things in a different way. So the way in which, for example, income levels mean that at the moment we're very privileged. I can sit at home and I can do my job in a very safe environment, you know, using all these remote technologies, etc. And so they shape what I'm exposed to. They shape a lot of my life experiences. So I agree with you. It's important to revisit this. And one of the useful things about it, I think, is if you do this exercise early on in PhD study, for example, and then you use reflexivity approaches to pick up on specific areas of positionality that you think are going to interact with your study, and then you can focus in on those, and as you say, track how they evolve over the course of the study, and how they perhaps are particularly experienced or picked up on in relation to your participants. Nadia, differences between yourself and research participants. Yeah. Pragya, were you going to comment?
Yeah, I was also saying the same thing. Like, so many reflections are coming up while doing this activity regarding my privilege with the target group, the target population we are thinking of, and also we are also thinking of the delivery agent, their education background, and compared to ours, and also the setting, the geographical setting that we are going to conduct. So many reflection and so many the privilege, and that definitely we need to think of before conducting the research there in the real setting. Thank you. That did me so much realization. Thank you, Anna.
Good. I'm glad it's a useful exercise. And I think a lot of what you're highlighting there as well emphasizes again the role that having a steering group or some experts by experience from the local community can help you to bridge those things. Because once you identify that there are these gaps, then it's about how can you what steps can you put in place to help you address some of those gaps so that they don't become problematic in the study, and so that you can try and overcome them as best you can, whilst recognizing that there's a lot of them that we can't completely get rid of. This isn't about trying to remove them, it's about recognizing that these are factors that will be at play. So there's also, thank you everyone for your comments there. There's also a list of questions here that again are on the slides that can help you to further engage with thinking about your positionality in relation to your topic. And the important point here is that all parts of your research proposal, conduct and dissemination, again, you know, positionality will arise. And then I just also wanted to revisit this slide, which again is thinking about the positionality and reflexivity, again, is it also in relation to how we engage with these wider socio-political movements and other social justice movements, and how those potentially inform and shape your research. So we're doing well. I've just got a final section on reflexivity that I'm going to run through. We should be finishing, I would hope, by about 12:10. So just to give you a little heads up there. Is everybody okay to keep going for this final bit? Or would you like to take a brief break? I'm guessing you're just going to want to keep going. Okay. So reflexivity. First of all, defining reflexivity. So there are some clear links between positionality and reflexivity. So as I've been highlighting, you often first engage with your positionality, which identifies areas that then you can reflexively consider as research progressive. In terms of the etymological root, which means the root of the word, i.e. the definition of it, reflexivity means to bend over backwards. And essentially this is a thoughtful, self-aware process where we think through the intersubjective dynamics between ourselves as researchers and those we are researching with. The idea is it facilitates greater insights into our personal and social experience and helps us challenge those conventional ideas of science as favouring professional objectivity over the engagement element. Fundamentally, it's about continually acknowledging and critiquing your role in research, so your beliefs, judgments and practices, and how these may have influenced the research process. So in this sense, reflexivity continually brings you back to positionality. So it's important to recognise that many aspects of your positionality are situated. So subjective elements, as Sihan was highlighting earlier, our values can and often do change over time. And therefore your positionality is never fixed and is always context dependent. Again, emphasising the relationship between positionality and reflexivity. So reflexivity being a way for us to explore various aspects of our positionality in the very specific situated context of a given research study, where this position intersects with the way in which we are producing knowledge about the topic. And adopting a reflexive approach aids you as a researcher in understanding how your positionality shapes knowledge construction. Our epistemological orientation is at play here. So this can shape how we consider both positionality and reflexivity. So for example, if conducting a positivist study, which seeks to mimic natural science positions, a reflexive account is more likely to adopt a third person narrative and kind of to think about value-free assumptions around research. Whereas an interpretivist tradition, more associated with a qualitative paradigm, they are more likely to see examples of researchers embracing a first-person narrative that unpacks various dimensions of researchers' beliefs, assumptions, and practices, and how these shape the processes and findings of research. So again, kind of thinking about both of these things. There is, as you can see from Cohen and Crabtree quote there in the middle, there is a good reason to adopt and to be thinking about positionality and reflexivity, no matter what paradigm we are approaching research from, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. You as a researcher are still going to be at play in the generation of that knowledge. There are some different types of reflexivity. It can be quite confusing as a term, as with many terms in research, because it's applied in a variety of ways and by different people and to various aspects of the research process. Most commonly, reflexivity is thought of as an introspective exercise, personal insight. Others also apply it to unpack aspects of social discourse. So for example, thinking about the social or political dimensions to research. And others still can consider it in relation to method, often in an effort to increase the validity or trustworthiness of their findings. So there's a paper by Monica Kraus which falls into this category. So she thinks about the role of labels in science, specifically interrogating how sociology and the social sciences observe and describe themselves. So kind of thinking methodologically to unpack what's going there in terms of knowledge production. And finally, reflexivity is an ongoing process throughout the research process, and it starts right now. So as you are developing and refining your research question and methods, you can prospectively think about it. So enhancing awareness of your social location, values, opinions, and experiences. And as we're highlighting, that can help emphasize some of the differences between you and your participants, and it can help you think in a preparatory way about what steps you could be taking to help you address some of those components of positionality and how they might play out in your research study. The other one is retrospectively. So it can entail reflexively considering the choices you made, such as the appropriateness of your methods for your target population. And it can also be a consideration of the impact of the research on the researcher. So those are two kind of core elements of retrospective consideration. And just to highlight here, obviously, retrospectively thinking about how you've conducted a study and potentially how you could have done it better in future, that is a really key component of a PhD research. Often this is the first time you will be stepping out and conducting your own research study, and it's a learning opportunity. It's not an opportunity to necessarily get everything 100% right. So remaining reflexively aware and helping to think about, do you know what, when I do this next time, what would I maybe amend? And not being afraid to say, do you know what, I'm not going to do this the same way as I've just done it, because that really hasn't worked and I need to rethink this before I go ahead. That's the sign of a researcher who's really engaged, embedded, and is acting with integrity rather than somebody who's got it wrong. So I encourage you to embrace that attitude. And just finally, some tools and approaches for reflexivity. So we went through this slide earlier, the ideas of speaking to your research stakeholders, sort of a steering committee, also thinking about your supervisors and peers and your participants, talking to them about their experiences of being involved in a study. Also, get yourself a research diary or a research journal where you can capture things. It's a really good way to capture thoughts on the research topic, how the study's going, what findings are emerging, what things you're finding really interesting, what things you weren't expecting, your ideas on how this might map onto wider literature or theoretical understandings of your topic, or things your study might be challenging, previously held ideas that you had that actually you're finding are changing as a result of the work you're conducting. And these diaries really map your critical reflexive engagement with your research. And they're very much a personal tool. They're for you and your self-development. It can be helpful to include prompts to engage your engagement with the research diary. So for example, in the data analysis process, you could have simple questions around what led me to this interpretation, or why do I think this is what my data is telling me? It's also a useful space to engage with things like mapping, simple diagrams that illustrate, for example, a situational map looking at your position in relation to your study, considering the people and relationships that you are developing along the way, or mapping the key theories and theorists you're engaging with, which is the example here. I have to highlight there's absolutely no way I could produce a map as detailed and as technically advanced as this. However, much simplified versions of this sort of thing I do find very, very useful. And in part, that's because they also help us to see what it is we're relying on, what literature it is we're turning towards, what theories it is we are engaging with, and what perhaps is missing. You could share that map with somebody and they could say, oh, have you thought about looking at X, Y, or Z literature? And it will help to enrich and further extend the work that you're doing. Final suggestions are around the stages at which we need to be retaining this very critical reflexive position. So in data analysis, so analysis is not a straightforward approach, particularly in qualitative data, but you will be engaging both with the data that you've collected and also be considering wider theoretical and empirical literature that again will shape what you see and what you don't see. So being aware of these choices and these avenues is an important element in the data analysis process. One way in analysis, which I'm sure Nadia will be picking up later on this week, but double coding, for example, qualitative transcripts can be a useful way of having a sort of touchstone in terms of what it is you are seeing in an interview versus what somebody else might be seeing in an interview. And that can help you to think through what is it that means that you are directed towards certain things. And also in our research reporting, including sections on positionality and reflexivity, this can really help enhance the rigor of research and its quality by making explicit the position from which you've approached a study. It can be hard to balance the recognition of potential alternative understandings to your data, for example, and while still giving authority to the account that you present. But here, this is where you can look to your study strengths and limitations section as a space to explore, for example, some of the methodological tensions, including revisiting aspects of reflexivity and how they might have played out in your research. So all of these approaches basically help us remain attentive to the impact of our research and in turn should promote more responsive and in-tuned engagement with participants and research practice, and therefore just enhance the ethical grounding of the research that you conduct. And 1 minute over time, that brings us to the end. I will stop the share so that we can come back together. And I welcome any questions, comments, reflections.
Just a quick realization. Thank you very much, first of all, Anna, for walking us through with this an important positionality and the philosophical sort of overview to keep in mind whenever you're engaging with whatever research question or whatever you're trying to do in research. This just sort of made me realize that last week, while doing the quantitative research methodology and looking at the quantitative methods, we kept mentioning about being aware of biases, the kinds of biases that very covertly sort of slip in. And it just made me realize that all of this exercise of reflexivity and trying to understand your positionality statement and where you are and where your participants are is a way of perhaps another approach to be mindful of all the kinds of biases that can seep in while you're not only collecting, but as well as when you're interpreting your data, analyzing it. That's the double coding. So I thought that
that's an interesting perspective, because there's actually quite a bit in the qualitative where there's a strong argument about this not being about bias. And I think that partly is a disciplinary bias that comes in there around being comfortable with this sort of terminology. But yeah, I agree with you. I think fundamentally that that idea holds, that it's about, I think more than bias, for me, it's about transparency. And that's fundamentally what it comes down to. And transparency can be in relation to kind of potential biases, or it can be a lot broader about how these things are shaping and informing the way in which we're conducting our research.
True. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have anything to add? I'm conscious that there's a lot of information that has been shared in 3 hours, and that's a lot for you all to take in and kind of to, you know, absorb and to think through. So obviously any thoughts that start popping up at other times, any queries that you've got, please do bring them back to us, to the group. I know there's a question and answer session on Thursday towards the end. And I'll have a look at my diary and see if I can join for that as well. And then if you've got any thoughts that have come up, we could pick them up then.
No, it was definitely a very useful presentation, and throughout this session, I was totally interested in it. Very useful. Thank you.
Good. Well, I'm glad it's been useful, and hopefully we'll have inspired you to go and look at some of these issues and think them through in a little bit more detail. But otherwise, Siham, I'm happy to hand over to you for closing.
No, thank you very much, Anna. We can bring today's session to a close. I will encourage fellows, just resonating what you've just said. Keep thinking. Let this sit with you for a while. We have another 3 days, and then we have that forum where we meet monthly. You can pick up issues when you start thinking of applying them to your respective research ideas and research projects. So lovely. Thank you very much for showing up. Thanks, Anna, for your engaging talk. We will resume tomorrow.
No problem. It's my pleasure. Nice to see you all. Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
See you
Bye.
all tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.